Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my 2024 LCK Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. Again, very excited to get into this. We did the LEC one just a couple of days ago, right before the start of their split. If you haven't seen that video, go ahead and check that out. There's going to be a couple of videos up in the iCard right now. Those videos are going to be that LEC Primer that we talked about for their winter split, but also my LCK off-season grades and review video. I graded and went over every single off-season here in the LCK. It was my most contentious video that I've ever put out by a gigantic margin. I don't think I've ever received even half as much pushback as I did on that video, and so go ahead and check that out if you want to go ahead and see maybe where some of the frustrations come from with a lot of the community. I've said multiple times over the past couple of weeks that I'm not too bothered by the pushback. I trust my process. I've been proven to be incredibly accurate, significantly more accurate than, quite frankly, any other analyst or any other consensus opinion over the past few years as I've covered the LCK on this channel, covered every single game, every single week. That opinion has definitely proven to be good over the past few years, and so I'm not too worried about my process being correct. But in today's video, essentially what we're going to be doing, if you're new to the channel, is going over all 10 of the LCK teams in the spring split here in 2024. I will be power ranking them from 10 to 1, including some tiers, which I'm incredibly excited to talk about. But let's get some ground rules out of the way, some housekeeping out of the way, because you do kind of have to do that in videos like this, or else your opinion is definitely going to be misconstrued. First of all, the aim of this video, it's going to be kind of for everybody. There's going to be a little bit for everybody. If you're new to the LCK, if you're somebody who's maybe watched a lot of the LCS and the LEC, or, just the Western leagues in general, and, is maybe trying to get into the LCK, not having watched it in previous years, or just wants to keep up, this video is for you. I'm going to be going over all 10 teams, their expectations, some of these players that, even though you might not know them, I'll kind of explain who they are and what you can expect from them, and maybe the arc that you can expect them to go on. But this is also for people who are fans of the LCK, because I will be giving power rankings and analysis for all 10 teams, and so it will also be an opinion piece. But that is exactly what it is. It is an opinion piece. This is, at the end of the day, just my opinion. If you disagree with it, that's great. I had a lot of pushback in the comment section of that grades video because people were a little bit different than where I was. Like, I would have a player graded at A-, and they would be like, how can you not have them at A? Or I would have a player at, like, B, and they're like, how are they not a B+, etc., etc. It is just my opinion, first of all, at the end of the day, and also, this is a very variable scale. These are very variable opinions. This isn't exactly a set-in-stone mindset. I don't really think like that. I don't think that analysis should ever be treated as such. I think in this video, what we're going to be doing is obviously ranking all of the players from 1 to 10 in their positions. If you want them 1, 2, 3 spots above or below where I have them ranked, if I have a player at 5 and you want them at 7 or you want them at 3, go ahead. Like, I'm not going to argue against that. That is close enough to the opinion that I have that I really won't be frustrated with that. This is just where I personally put a lot of these players. Again, I've watched every single game of the LCK over the past, well, I've covered all of the games over the last 3 years, but I've been watching the LCK since 2014 every single week. And so, I definitely like to believe that I've got something pretty good here. I have a little bit of an algorithm, talked about that a bit in the LEC video, that kind of, I input some of my own little variables and how valuable I think some players are, both in the short term and the long term, some upside and potential. That's weighted against how valuable each position is calculated in the LCK, because some positions are just going to be valued a bit more than others, because some positions just have more talent than others. It's more detrimental to have a bad mid laner than it is to have a bad support in the LCK. It just is at the current moment. But, that's going to calculate out this number 10 through number 1. I have overridden it in a couple of spots, but for the most part, actually, in the LCK, it's basically exactly what the algorithm spit out for me. I'm going to go ahead and talk about that as well, but, I'm excited to get into it. That's kind of the housekeeping out of the way. Again, if you want to have a discussion about what you agree with and what you disagree with down in the comment section below, I'd love to have that. Discussions are always great, but they have to be discussion-oriented. I'm not going to respond to you if you comment something like, I knew this video was trash when I saw X and X rating, right? Like, that's just not, you're not here for a discussion. And so, I'm happy to have those conversations down in the comment section, but, you know, with all that housekeeping out of the way, again, I know it's always so much to talk about at the beginning of these videos, but I have to say those things or else, you know, there's going to be a lot of miscommunication down in the comment section below. If I don't stress that these are just my opinions and that the scale is rather flexible, then I just think there's going to be a lot of confusion down in the comments, as there was in the previous video when I didn't specify enough. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new to the channel, what we're going to do is go from number 10 to number 1 in these rankings, talking about all 5 players on all 10 teams, kind of giving you analysis on who they are as players, what the team's ceiling and floor is, and just kind of the overall expectation for them going into the season, whether or not I'm higher or lower than what I believe to be consensus. And of course, I will also be ranking every single player in terms of their position. Worth noting again, housekeeping-wise, that some positions are just stronger than others. Being the number 4 or the number 5 ranked mid laner or top laner in the LCK is just more valuable than being the number 4 or 5 ranked support. Just because 2 players have the same number below their name does not mean I believe they are the same grade. That's where you can check out the grades video that I released earlier in the offseason. So let's jump right into it. We're going to be starting off, of course, at number 10, and this is going to be kicking off our C tier. We're going to be going from C to B to A to S tier in terms of the rankings here in the LCK. I do think it's worth noting that, I mean, you could call this the D, C, B, and A tier. These are just the 4 tiers that I classify them as, but I do think the top teams are S tier teams globally, so I have these classified as C, B, A, and S. And kicking off our C tier, and for me, coming in as the number 10 ranked team in my preseason power rankings, it is going to be NS RedForce. I think this is really only fair after what we saw last year. I think it's, you know, maybe not the most common opinion. You've seen a lot of optimism surrounding this team because they have brought back a lot of players, or all 5 players from last split, but I really wasn't super impressed with what they were doing last split. I think the growth that they showed towards the end of summer was rather artificial, in my opinion, because I think the league just got significantly worse over the back half of the summer split. Specifically, the bottom tier teams in the league were just not very good, and I think, you know, the growth that they showed in summer was them taking advantage of some teams that were even more catastrophically bad than they were, and outside of that, they were pretty consistently the worst team in the LCK last year, and they made no changes. I think there's reason to believe that maybe some of these players can get better as the year went on, but at least at the beginning of the year, it's really hard for me to believe that this is going to be anything other than a struggling team in the LCK in 2024. So let's go ahead and talk about it. First of all, what you're seeing on your screen here. Obviously, at the top, you can see the team and their logo, but the information that's listed on the screen, you can see spring split, summer split in terms of what their records and placements were in those splits last year, the season finals, which is the regional qualifier. Obviously, NS did not qualify. They were 10th in terms of championship points last year, and where they are trending, and that's going to really only affect, you know, what the difference is between their placement at the end of last year and their placement on the power rankings this year. NS staying the same. They were 10th in terms of championship points in 2023. I have them 10th in 2024. Of course, all 5 members of the team are listed here with a number below them. That's going to be where I rank them in terms of their position. Again, like I said earlier, not all positions are created equally, and so ranking high in some positions is going to be more valuable than ranking highly in others, and I'll kind of talk about that as we go throughout the rest of this video. But let's talk about NS. Their lineup in 2024, at least for now, is looking like Din in the top lane, Sylvie in the jungle, Fiesta in the mid lane, Jiwoo at AD carry, and Peter at support. Again, it's the same 5 that they were trotting out by the end of last year. Jiwoo was kind of a late addition towards this team, replacing Vital throughout the midway part of this year, and Jiwoo was really good. We'll talk about this bot lane first because I do think this is the strength of this team. Jiwoo won quite a few games for this team down the stretch last year. If there is a reason to be optimistic about NS potentially being better than what they were in 2023, it's the fact that this bot lane gets another year to kind of grow together. I really like both of these players as prospects moving forward in the LCK, and to me, they are by far the most proven part of this team. Jiwoo's mechanically just very talented. He is somebody who, even with very little resources, is going to be very active in the mid game, and that's a quality that you very rarely see from middle tier AD carries. It's really just kind of the upper tier best of the best that are able to play at that level. When you think of mid game AD carries that kind of dominate, you think of players like Ruler and you think of players like Viper. Those are the players that really kind of take over in that stage of the game. It's not usually a player like Jiwoo, but talent-wise, he is kind of, you know, on the trajectory to be one of the more interesting AD carries in the LCK, in my opinion. He was very hard stuck on this team last split, and You know, I think it's great that he was able to get a spot again. I think for a lot of this offseason, I was concerned that he wasn't going to be playing in the LCK at all, but at least he's on a team, even if it's not a team that I project to be particularly good. I think he is definitely the strength of this team. That being said, he is certainly not a proven player. He's not even played the entirety of a split yet in the LCK, and so, you know, there's still reason to believe that maybe he could come crashing back down to earth, but I really like the tape that I saw from him, and I think it's really, really smart of them to bring him back, and I think him and Peter have very good chemistry. Peter is somebody who I've obviously praised a lot in the past. When you look back on 2022, that was a year where I was really, you know, hyping up Peter all the time because he was coming into this Nongshim team that was a disaster after signing a bunch of veterans, and he was really the best player on that team, and then he kept getting benched for effort, and I was just losing my mind, right? He finally got an opportunity to actually play last year, and he was pretty good. He wasn't sensational. He wasn't this amazing support prospect, kind of like he was in 2022, where I was looking at him as a potential like top 5 support in the LCK. Didn't necessarily play up to that in 2023, but I think him and Jiwoo are honestly a really interesting bot lane moving forward. They are the thing keeping this team relevant. If they didn't have this bot lane, I would be a lot more concerned about this team and about their potential moving into the future, but I do like these two quite a bit, and when you're looking for positives, those are the two that I really want to point out. The rest of this team isn't necessarily awful. I don't want to make it seem like I'm super negative on the top side of the map for Nongshim, but I do think it is definitely a lot less proven on the top side of this map. We'll start with the top laner here in Din. He's the player that I am the least sure of on this team, or the least confident in on this team. He wasn't the worst player on this team last year. Mid-jungle were a problem, but mid-jungle were really good in Tier 2 in the LCK Challengers League for a long time, and, you know, I had a lot of hype and potential and excitement for them at the beginning of last year, and things just didn't end up working out. I've never really been a huge fan of Din as a top lane prospect, and he also wasn't very good in the LCK last year. He was very clearly the worst top laner in the LCK, and I don't really see any reason to believe that that's going to be any different this split. I think top lane has honestly gotten better. It's gotten more consistent as we've moved into a couple of different, you know, decisions in the offseason here, and, you know, I think Din's going to struggle just as much as he did last split. His laning stats were not very good, and honestly, he never really had, you know, any sort of lead or even like a neutral state going into the mid to late game last year, and so I can't really judge his mid to late game all that much. He was never playing from a position where he could actually be all that relevant, and when he was, a lot of the focus was on bot lane anyways here for Nongshim, and so it was just very difficult to get an idea for what Din wanted to do. You know, and that being said, like, I'm just not super hyped about him. He's just kind of fine, and I think top lane in the LCK is really strong. Honestly, there are 9 like very solid top laners in the LCK, and then Din to me is the very clear number 10, at least coming into 2024. Perhaps he could change that. I know there are other analysts out there that are more excited about him than I am. You know, a lot of the other co-streamers are a lot more excited about him than I am, but I just have not seen it. I didn't see it in the Challengers League, and I haven't seen it yet in the LCK either, but it's kind of the opposite here for Sylvie and Fiesta. I'm going to talk about them as kind of a package duo. I believe it's going to be Fiesta starting here. Call Me is still on the roster, and Call Me, in my opinion, is the player that should be playing in the mid lane, but I believe it will be Sylvie and Fiesta starting off the year here as the jungle mid duo for Nongshim. Both of these players were players I was very excited about, like I said, at the beginning of 2023. They were both amazing in the Challengers League in 2022 when Nongshim's Challengers team was the best in the Challengers League, kind of surprising a lot of people. It was the reason they had a lot of confidence promoting basically the entire team to the LCK, and those were the two that I felt the best about, but they were the two that struggled by far the most in the LCK in year 1. Sylvie lost a lot of games for this team last year because he's just way too passive in the early game. He's not somebody who makes this, you know, makes ridiculous amounts of mistakes. He's not somebody that like throws the game away, if you will, but he's really not somebody who has been winning games at all for this Nongshim team. He's just really, really slow in the early game, and he often gets outscaled and often just has no impact on the game, which is very scary in the LCK when you can talk about a lot of other junglers being very impactful in the mid game specifically. It just didn't feel like Sylvie had that same level. Maybe it's a confidence thing. Maybe it was just the way the team wanted to play around jungle. I'm not going to sit here and say that there's one exact reason why Sylvie didn't end up working out on this team last year, but he really didn't. He was very bad, and Fiesta might have been the single worst player in the LCK in terms of actual value. He was really, really bad. I mean, he was getting outclassed in lane every single game, and yes, like, mid lane in the LCK is a really, really tough position to play because you're playing the best in the world like half of your games, but the other half of those games, you're not really playing like superstars, right? Like, the bottom half teams in the LCK, they don't have these phenomenal mid laners. I talk about this with mid lane a lot. Like, you think of mid lane in the LCK as this super prestigious position to have because the top end talent, like the top 5 guys, are all world class, but you know, it's not exactly the deepest position, and Fiesta still was losing to basically everybody. He got replaced midway through the year, ended up coming back in for Nongshim down the stretch. I just never saw it at the LCK level. He felt very overmatched, and he's going to have changed something in the offseason. He's going to have gotten more confident. He's going to have gotten a little bit more of, you know, maybe that shove and roam style that we've seen other LCK mids start to adapt. Maybe that's what he needs to pick up to maybe be less of a focal point. But for one reason or another, he simply has to be better. The mechanics and the talent just weren't there in 2023. It's going to have to simply be better. But we know these two can be good. They dominated Tier 2 for a little while. If you're getting the upside of Nongshim that this team clearly wanted to invest in last year, the reason they brought back all 5 members, then I think this could be an interesting team. Remember, I had them ranked, I think, 7th? Maybe 8th, somewhere around there going into 2023, which surprised a lot of people. I was very high on the idea of this Nongshim RedForce team, you know, being promoted from the Challengers League and being relevant in year 1 because I liked a lot of the names. I liked a lot of the talent. It didn't end up working out. Their macro was horrendous, but there is reason to believe that, you know, another year of all 5 playing together could go better because, you know, they did get a bit better in the summer split. Like I said, I chalk a bit of that up to the fact that the bottom of the LCK got significantly worse in the summer split, but it is, you know, something to at least consider. But at least for now, until they prove something on the Rift, there's just nowhere other than the bottom of the LCK, the bottom of C tier, and the number 10 spot in the power rankings that I can give them at the moment. And moving on now to number 9 in the power rankings. This one's not going to come as a major surprise to anybody who watched my grades video that I put out in the offseason. I lambasted this team's offseason. I was really not excited about the things that they did, and because of that, I think they are pretty convincingly a bottom 2 team, perhaps even a bottom 1 team if everything goes wrong. They are going to be the other team, the final team in the C tier here, so rounding that off and coming in at number 9 for me, it is going to be OK Savings Bank BRION. I have them coming in at number 9. I think some other analysts are going to have them a bit higher. I think there are other teams that maybe some people are a little bit less confident in, but to me, it is very clear who the bottom 2 teams, at least going into the year, in the LCK are, and to me, it's Nongshim and it's BRION. I just see them as the 2 worst teams on paper by a pretty significant margin. I do think there is a pretty big tier gap between these 2 teams and everybody else. There just isn't a lot to be super excited about on this team, and I'm a bit worried about where they're going to get their wins. At least for Nongshim, you have the upside and potential of like Sylvie and Fiesta being better than they were last year, and perhaps all 5 coming together and having better macro after they were the worst macro team in the LCK in 2023. But for BRION, I just really struggle to see like where you're going to get your wins in this, you know, in this season. I don't see it with this roster, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Morgan in the top lane, Gideon in the jungle, Karis in the mid lane, Envy at AD carry, and Effort at support. We'll start with topside. We'll start with the players who were staying here on BRION, starting with Morgan, because I think Morgan is pretty clearly the best player on this team. He was the best player on this team last year, and I think that will continue. I think him and Umti were trying to play a lot of games together. You know, I've had my takes on Umti in the past where, you know, he'll have 4 or 5 really good games to split, and then like the other 20 will be really bad. But, you know, Morgan, I think, was easily the most consistent member BRION had in 2023, and I don't really see any reason to expect that not to happen in 2024. The player that I compare Morgan to is, for you LPL fans out there, is Wayward. I think they're very similar players. I think both of them were on very high-profile teams at the starts of their careers. Morgan, obviously, on that Hanwha Life team with Chovy, with Deft, and, you know, really trying to make that thing work, and he was kind of the scapegoat for when that team didn't end up performing at Worlds. He was considered the Renekton one-trick. He was shoved onto a bottom-tier team, but ever since, you know, he's joined a bottom-tier team, he's actually been really good for them, and he's proven that maybe he was a little overmatched playing with, like, one of the best teams in the world, but is definitely, you know, elo held now that he's on an actual bad team. He was always somewhere in the middle. I think something similar will happen to Wayward. It's not LPL analysis time, though, but Morgan's a really solid player. Definitely more comfortable on these early game aggressive bruisers. Obviously, the Renekton, but things like the Jax also fit that description. I think he's just pretty consistent in those roles. He can play tanks. He can kind of do what you need him to do. He's a good player. I don't think he's a star, and I do think he's the best player on this team, which I do think is a bit of a concern because I'm not sure Morgan is the kind of player that you can play for every single game, but he might have to be if this team ends up panning out in the way that I think it will. The other 2 players you're bringing back Karis in the mid lane. I had him at 10 at the start of this offseason in terms of the mid lane rankings. I moved him up to number 9 as I watched more tape on him because I do think there are at least some good games, and Fiesta was a bit of a disaster last year, even if I do think Fiesta has more theoretical upside. Karras, I think, has a slightly higher floor, but Karras is not a good mid laner. I want that to be clear. He was benched midway through the summer split because he was so bad in the LCK, and then Ivory was so much worse that they had to put Karras back in. Karras was a bit better in the final, like, 2 weeks of the split, but that's such a small sample size, and honestly, he's just not been a good player at the LCK level the entirety of his career. He was not good on Hanwha, and he's not been good here on BRION. For him to get brought back here, you know, clearly they continue to see upside in him, and, you know, there was a point in time where I saw upside on him when he was first brought into the LCK on Hanwha Life. It's just not there for me anymore. I'm looking at the tape that I've seen in the LCK, and I see a player that has not developed, that has not really grown at all over the course of the last 2 years, who clearly does not have the support system around him to continue to get better, and I don't really expect that to change in 2024. I think he will continue to be one of the weaker mid laners, and, you know, like I said with, you know, Fiesta and Nongshim, that's a problem. You can't really be an awful mid laner that has trouble winning lane and supporting the rest of his team, because that's too influential of a role in the way that LCK teams like to play the game. Then you've got effort. You're bringing effort back here in the support position. You know, I'm pretty low on effort. That's been well documented. Go back to 2022. I complained about effort every single week on this channel. He was a bit better, I guess, in 2023, if only for the fact that he wasn't the single worst player in the LCK by a gigantic margin like he was in 2022, but he still wasn't very good. He's going to come in as my number 9 support, and supports aren't exactly like the most stacked role in the LCK at the current moment. Coming in at number 9 is pretty darn bad for effort. He's just not a particularly good player. His time, you know, at the top of the standings in terms of the teams that he was playing on, you know, it was short-lived, and he was quickly replaced, and he went to a team, you know, he went to these bottom-tier teams that just, you know, couldn't hide his flaws nearly as much anymore, and that continues to be an issue. He's really bad in lane, but his decision-making in the mid-game is just putrid. He will die randomly every single game at least once for absolutely no reason, and it's just frustrating to watch. Obviously, you can make the argument that that's a team issue, but it follows effort everywhere he goes, no matter what team he is on. And so, you know, at this point, I just have to believe it's something that he is going to add, or I guess subtract, from the teams that he is on, and that's just, you're going to have to live with that. And I think that that's going to be a bit of a problem, because the two main additions that you're bringing into the team here, both from the LPL last split, were not good. They were both benched at the end of the year for bad LPL teams, or at least non-playoff LPL teams in the case of Gideon, who we will talk about. Played in the spring split for Invictus Gaming, ended up getting replaced by Tianjin. Not a good sign. I'm not a huge fan of Tianjin. I know the org and, you know, some LPL fans are a little bit more excited about him than I am. Never really saw it in his tape, but, you know, for Gideon to get replaced by him and for Tianjin to go on to be the most volatile jungler in the entirety of the LPL, it's not a good sign. He's going to come in as my number 9 jungle, just above Sylvie, because at least he had a couple of good games on Invictus last year. It certainly wasn't consistent, but when Gideon played well, they were able to win games, which is why Invictus was a bit scary at the beginning of the year. I just don't see that translating over here to the LCK. He's a pretty aggressive player, but not aggressive in the sense where I think he gets his laners ahead, but rather I think he flips a lot of games early on, and I think that that's going to be a bit of a problem for this BRION team, because I don't think they're talented enough to be able to win isolated in 1v1 or 2v2 matchups in lane to allow Gideon to play as aggro as he wants and with as much pressure as he typically wants, like he was able to with players like You Should Know Me last year in the LPL. And so I'm not a huge fan of Gideon. You know, I was at the beginning of last year. I thought he was an interesting jungle prospect, but, you know, his time at the major league level has just not been particularly good. He's going to have to prove a lot to me. And then your big, like, veteran signing here was Envy in the bot lane. And again, if you watch that video, the grades video, I'm not a fan of Envy. He has been mediocre at best every single stop he has been at. His best split by far was that one split he had on Sandbox where he got to play with Kale. But even then, like, he got replaced midway through that year for Teddy, and he ends up going over to the LPL playing for LGD Gaming and getting replaced on that team. And they won 2 series all year long last year. If he can't even start for that team, that's a bit of a concern. He is going to come in as the number 8 AD carry because, you know, the bottom of the AD carry tree is also pretty bad in the LCK, but I don't have any faith in him to be able to consistently carry games for this team. When he was playing with good players on that Live Sandbox team in spring of last year, he was just fine. Still a significant downgrade to a player in Prince that they had the year before, and was, you know, less impactful than a player like Teddy, even when the team started to fall apart in the summer split for reasons that weren't the bot lane. And so, you know, I don't have any confidence that Envy effort as a bot lane is going to be anything other than, at best, like a bottom 3 bot lane in the LCK. And then you're looking at a bottom 2 mid laner, you're looking at a jungle jungler who's going to flip games and lose a lot for you, and then, you know, a top laner who's fine, but certainly isn't a superstar. Again, I just don't see a lot of avenues for this team to consistently be able to win games, and that concerns me. If you're not going to be able to consistently win games, you're going to be one of the worst teams in the league. Now, BRION at other times has overperformed in the spring split. It's kind of been a little bit of an MO for this team in the past, and, you know, potentially they could do that again. Maybe they finish in 7th or 8th in the spring split, but I think talent-wise, they will eventually regress to where they're supposed to be, which talent-wise on this team, I think is a bottom 2 team in the league, and it's why they come in as the same tier as the number 10 team. If they're the worst team in the LCK this year, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. I know I'm going a bit against the grain when I say this, but I think this team is going to be a lot worse than people expect in 2024. Now we're moving on to the top 8, and this is going to be the start of my B tier. I think this is teams that, you know, I never really described C tier. These are the teams, the C tier were the teams that I think were the bottom of the LCK, clear bottom 2 in my opinion, in terms of roster construction. I thought BRION and Nongshim were very much the 2 teams I would expect to finish bottom 2 in this split, but as we get into the B tier here, these are teams that I think theoretically could make top 6. I mean, top 6 is playoffs, and I think anybody from this point onwards could make playoffs if things end up going right. Obviously, I end up having a top 6 myself, but these are teams that maybe aren't projected playoff teams, but could very well expect to see themselves there if everything, you know, starts to move in a good direction for them. And coming in at number 8 and at the bottom of that B tier for me, it is going to be FearX, the new, I guess, rebranded team here in the LCK, rebranding from Live Sandbox over to FearX, over to Fox. And with a new rebrand comes a bit of a new roster, not exactly the most different roster of all time. With the rebrand, your top side's basically the same as it was towards the end of the year. You just have a new bot lane, but I do like a couple of the pieces on this team. I like that you were able to retain a couple of the players on this team, and, you know, generally, I think there is more upside in this team than maybe the other 2 that we've talked about up until this point, but I do still have a lot of concerns, and I'm certainly not ridiculously high on this team. I feel pretty confident putting them at the bottom of B tier, I'll just say that. But their lineup in 2024 at the moment is looking like Clear in the top lane, Willer in the jungle, Closer in the mid lane, Hanwha at AD carry, and Execute, formerly Jonghoon, at support. Very excited to see how this team ends up working out because I think it's a pretty interesting collection of players. I think obviously retaining 3 of the 5 in the top side of the map for FearX is good. Really only one of those players I feel super confident in, which is going to be in the jungle position with Willer, but I think Clear has some upside. Closer's fine as a player, very limited in terms of what he offers, but he does offer the thing that he offers, and so you're not going to be super frustrated. It's mostly the bot lane that does concern me a bit here, and I will talk about that when we get there, but let's talk about these individual players. Let's start with Clear in the top lane. Some people might want to see him a bit higher on this list, but honestly, he was only okay in the summer split last year. So much went wrong for this team. Obviously, Bertle was not very good in the summer split. He's over in the LPL now on LGD Gaming. Clear ended up taking over about midway through, I would say, the summer split last year, towards the end of summer split. He was a bit better than Bertle, but he certainly wasn't fantastic. He's going to have to be a lot better in order for this team to compete at a pretty high level. Like I've talked about a lot, top lane in the span of like the last, I don't know, 2 years has gone from the weakest position globally by far to probably the deepest position globally by far, in my opinion. And, you know, I think Clear being at number 9 kind of embodies that. He's a solid player. He's certainly someone that, you know, in previous years, I would have considered him a borderline top 6 top lane guy, and he still is a borderline top 6 top lane kind of guy, even going into the year. Like I talked about, the ranking specifically in a position like top lane is very flexible because all of these players are very good, and Clear certainly has a good amount of upside. I'm just not exactly sure where the floor is for him as a player. We've heard about the upside for a long time. Obviously, when he was on the DRX Challengers team, he was talked about very highly, but, you know, we've kind of seen a lot of players that were, you know, prioritized very highly from DRX's system get called up in the past few years, specifically the KDF bot lane, and just really not work out. Clear has kind of been in that zone for me where he was a really dominant Challengers player, and he just hasn't been, you know, as dominant in the LCK. He's been fine, but you need to be a bit better than fine in terms of top lane right now. I'm, you know, leaning to the side that he's actually going to be pretty good at the LCK level, and this is definitely more of a, you know, low ranking for what he is going to offer in 2024, but I think at least with what we've seen so far, this is pretty much the only spot that I could put him in at the moment. But, you know, mid jungle I think is fine. I think it's pretty solid. I really like Willer. I think Willer is a really, really fun player here. He was really good on Hanwha, like secretly very good on Hanwha. They ended up benching him, you know, for on Fleek, and that didn't make any sense in 2022. It was a complete no-brainer, especially because throughout the year, On Fleek was one of the worst players in the LCK, certainly the worst jungler in the LCK in 2022, and they just had Willer sitting on the bench. Willer gets another spot to start here on Live Sandbox in 2023, and basically completely, you know, rehabilitates his image in one split, was an all-pro caliber jungler in 2023. In the spring split, at least. In summer, it was definitely a bit more shaky. He was not nearly as good in summer, but this team in general was not nearly as good in summer, as you can see from the standings. And, you know, considering the fact that the league itself got worse for them to, you know, have dropped a standing, it's not particularly good. But Willer is the player that I think I'm the most confident in moving into 2024. The talent has kind of always been there for him. I think he just relies a bit on the teammates that are surrounding him, and his lanes just weren't winning in the summer split. I think if his lanes are a bit better, which I think they probably will be in this year, then I think Willer's going to be just fine, and he could potentially get back into that like top 4, top 5 ranking in the jungle position. And then you've got Closer coming back here in the mid lane. Closer is the definition of a player that I'm just kind of bleh on. Like I don't really have this really high opinion of him. He's like the definition of a B-, if you will, in terms of my grading scale, if you remember that from my video, where it's just like, he's fine. He's going to win you some games. He's going to lose you some games. There are going to be some games where he's a non-factor. He's whatever. I'm not super high on him, but again, this kind of draws back. He's going to come in as my number 6 mid laner in the LCK. I talked about the top 5 mid laners in the LCK all being incredibly strong, like game-changing players, and I truly believe that. It's unfair that one of them has to come in at number 5, but everybody outside of that is really up for debate. If Closer, for me, is coming in at number 6, that should show you just how volatile the bottom of the mid lane standings in the LCK are. I think Closer is fine, but I certainly don't think he's the type of player that I feel great about. I'm definitely lower on him than consensus. You still see a lot of people holding on to hope because of, you know, that former pedigree that he had, being able to kind of come in and take some time away from Faker on T1. You know, that was really good, and, you know, Closer definitely has his style. He likes to play those melee assassins. He likes to be, you know, a lot more of a carry-oriented player in the mid lane, but when he's not on those picks, he's just fine. He's really not this game-breaking player. He's somebody that you can win with. You can be a top, you know, 4 or 5 team in the LCK with Closer in the mid lane. He just can't be the player that you're playing through, I think, to do that. I think him and Willer have relatively okay chemistry. I would like to see them play towards Willer more in terms of that duo, but generally speaking, I don't think you're going to lose games because of Closer in the mid lane. I'm just lower on his potential in terms of what he offers at a high level, like when you're talking about potentially trying to make the playoffs. But then you've got a brand new bot lane. You're bringing Hanwha and Execute in here. Hanwha is a player that I'm really not all that excited about. He's going to come in as my number 9 AD carry, and if you've seen the other AD carries that have already come in above him, I mean, Envy came in above him, and I'm very low on Envy. That should show you where I am on Hanwha as a player. I feel like this is a player that's gotten chance after chance after chance in the LCK, and has simply never been anything other than a slightly below average AD carry at this level. There are some games where he's looked okay, where he's been fine, but, you know, for the most part, he's just been whatever as a player. For this to be like one of the bigger FearX signings of the offseason, to go from, you know, Prince to Envy to Teddy to Hanwha, like, it just feels like you're moving downwards in that trajectory, and this is a big reason why this team comes in at number 8 and at the bottom of the B tier for me, is because I just don't really have a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to play through bot lane like at all throughout this year, and it's frustrating because I really like Execute. I really liked Jonghoon when he was in the LEC, obviously coming back over from Europe, coming back over from Astralis. I made a joke on Twitter, a quick plug. Follow me on Twitter. I'm a lot more lax and chill on that side of the internet, but I made a joke on Twitter where I was like, how is it possible that Jonghoon came back to the LCK and downgraded bot laners, going from Kobe to Hanwha? And I honestly think that that's kind of the case here. I think he's a really interesting player. He's going to come in as my number 6 support. He was one of the best supports in the LEC for basically the last 2 years on a really bad or a really inconsistent Astralis team. And for him to come over to the LCK, I think he's more than earned the possibility of being a really strong player here in Korea. And it's just sucky because I don't think this bot lane's going to be very good. Henna's not a very good laner, and Execute is kind of a lane-dominant player. He's a pike player. He's a hook player, a playmaker, somebody who wants to be very aggressive. Sometimes he's going to get himself into trouble, but for the most part, it's actually more valuable for him to play the way that he plays than, you know, for him to play more safe. And You know, I would think in a different bot lane matchup, perhaps I would like Execute's status in the LCK a tad bit more, but I'm really not super stoked because, again, I just don't see Hanwha as this super high upside or even high floor player that you're getting here in the bot lane. I think this bot lane's going to hold this team back a bit. I'm really not super high on mid lane. I'm really not super high on top lane. You know, I think this team's fine. They are a tier above, you know, the bottom two teams in my opinion, but there is a reason that they come in at number 8 and not at number 7 or at number 6 or a team that I truly believe is going to be competing for a playoff spot. And that's because I just don't really see their talent as complete. I don't like the makeup of their team. I think this is a team that's kind of designed to play through mid lane, and, you know, that just puts a lot of pressure on a player in closer that I think is pretty bannable at the current moment. And so, you know, hopefully I'm wrong. I like the rebrand. I really like the new logo. You know, FearX is an interesting name, representing the Fox legacy with Echo Fox, you know, being gone and done and dusted from League Esports is a very fun kind of thing. And I like Willer and Execute individually as players. I just think the rest of this team kind of surrounding them isn't exactly as dominant as I would like, and I would expect them to just kind of be a lower to middle tier team in the LCK in 2024. And now we move on to number 7 in the power rankings, right in the middle of that B tier, and my final projected non-playoff team here in the spring split, and it really pains me. It really does pain me to not put this team in the top 6, but their flaws are just a little bit too much for me to feel confident to do that. Coming in at number 7 for me, it's going to be the Kwangdong Freecs, and it just sucks because I really, really like this team. I think the top side of this map, your top jungle and your mid laner, that's a playoff top jungle mid, period. End of story. Like, that's a team that, at best, could, like, if they continue to develop, could, like, potentially push to maybe go to Worlds. Like, they're that good, but this bot lane is such a question mark. And I say that, you know, I changed my wording midway through saying that sentence from a hindrance to a question mark because I don't want to sit here and say they're guaranteed to be awful, but man, it's just, I don't expect them to be anything other than the worst bot lane in the LCK, and that is simply a massive hindrance for a team that is going to try and make an actual push here. And so to balance that out, they end up coming in the final non-playoff spot for me. But again, this team definitely has playoff upside, and we will go ahead and talk about that. Their lineup is looking like Dudu in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, Bulldog in the mid lane, Taiyun at AD carry, and Ondil at support. This is a really, really fun team. I've got to be entirely honest. I wish I could, you know, speak highly of this team. You know, for a lot of this offseason, I did have them as my 6th and final playoff team, you know, just because I felt like there was going to be a lot of progression. I think the signing that they made this offseason was incredibly smart and really one of the best of the entire offseason by any team, and I think retaining the top side of the map was huge. I think the development that we saw from some of these players was really good, but not changing up that bot lane is a disaster, in my opinion, and I think it will come back to bite them. But let's talk about the top side and the good parts first, starting with Dudu. If you want to, we haven't said the word channel darling on this video yet. We say it a lot in these videos, but Dudu is absolutely a channel darling for this channel. I've sung his praises a lot. He comes in as my number 4 top laner. I think he could absolutely be the type to break into the top 2, top 3 if things continue to go right. He was a top 3 top laner in the LCK last year. Maybe not so much towards the end of summer, when this team really just, like, stopped trying. He was the one who was dragging them to wins. You can see they won 4 series in the summer split last year. All 4 of those were basically won by Dudu, and then eventually down the stretch, you know, this bot lane was the worst lane in basically any major region, and they were losing games, and Bulldog had, you know, already started to kind of mentally check out. Gen.G was never really the star jungler. I think Dudu ended up just kind of turning it off down the stretch, but if he's motivated again, I mean, he was awesome in 2022. He was one of the more interesting breakout top laners in 2022, and then he really followed that up with an even better year in 2023. I think he could be a top 2, top 3 top laner in the LCK, and I think by the end of the year, if Kwangdong ends up being better than I think, if this bot lane can survive, like if this team ends up actually being good, there's not really a talent, you know, ceiling that I think stops Dudu from being like a top 5 top laner in the world. I genuinely think that is the kind of upside and ceiling that he has as a player, and I think this team is incredibly happy to be able to bring him back. And then you're bringing in Cuz in the jungle. What an amazing signing. It was the only signing this team made this offseason, if you don't count, you know, Ondil getting the full-time starting job here at the support position. But what a bring-in. I mean, for a team that isn't necessarily one of the top tier teams in the LCK, for them to be able to go out and get one of the top tier, you know, players at a premium position in Cuz, somebody who just was a very, very important and critical piece towards the number 1 seed in the LCK in the summer split. That's a massive get, and Cuz has only gotten better, I think, over the course of his career. There were times during kind of the peak of his time, you know, on top teams like T1 where he was just fine. He wasn't like a star, he was just good, but he went over to KT Rolster, and honestly, it felt like something clicked for him. He was really good in 2022, but he was even better in 2023, where he continued to level up. He's going to come in as my number 4 jungler, and if you know the top end of the jungle pool, that's pretty darn good. Spoiler alert, he comes in just below players like Owner and Canyon, which is pretty darn good. Like that's a pretty good company to be in, and I really think Cuz deserves to be mentioned in that sphere with how he has played over the past couple of years. He's been a genuine difference maker on top tier teams, worlds caliber teams, worlds quarterfinals caliber teams, and for him to come over to Kwangdong to play with a really strong top laner and a really talented up and coming mid laner, it's a super fun situation for him. And honestly, you know, that signing makes this team incredibly competitive basically on its own. But you retained Bulldog here in the mid lane. People were so high on Bulldog going into 2023. He was the youngest player in the LCK last year, and he showed it both for good and for bad. He showed why, as the youngest player in the LCK, he was given an opportunity at such a young age, and it's because how mechanically talented he is. He really can go toe-to-toe with anybody in the mid lane in terms of laning. Now, the consistency has certainly not been there. Spring was kind of a breakout split for him. He was really fun to watch in the spring split, but summer wasn't nearly as good. He definitely took a step back. Now, can you chalk that up to the fact that the rest of the team was really bad? Bot lane was losing games by themselves every single game, and he could have mentally checked out. Absolutely, that could absolutely be the case, but I do need to see some positive trajectory because it wasn't necessarily an up curve over the course of 2023. That being said, the potential is there. Even I was wrong about where his potential could be in year 1. I'm really excited to see what could happen in year 2, especially because you're bringing in Cuz in the jungle. I think Cuz is somebody who plays incredibly well around his mid lane, and if Bulldog's going to get even more resources over the course of this year, if he's going to be given a bigger role on this team, I think he's the type of player that could very much take that and run with it and become one of the more interesting mid laners in the league. I have him at number 7. Very much wanting to put him at 6, but I think Closer is just a better player right now. I would be surprised if Bulldog was not a better player by the end of the year, though. That is a statement I definitely will make. But all of this positivity, all of this optimism has to kind of be tempered a little bit because of this bot lane, Taiyun and Andil. Taiyun was the single worst player in the LCK last year. Miserable, just absolutely miserably bad. It was between him and Fiesta, but I would take Fiesta probably over Taiyun. I think Taiyun is not an LCK caliber player. I think he was getting destroyed in lane. I think his mechanics in team fights are rough, to say the least. I think he just, last year, looked like a non-LCK player. He is the only C- grade that I gave out, other than his bot lane partner, obviously, but this was the only C- that I gave out in any major region across all 4 of the major region grades videos that I did. Like, that's how bad they were. They were unplayable last year, and he's getting another shot here, and I think it's concerning because this top side got better with the addition of Cuz over Youngjae. They certainly got more upside in terms of what they might be able to perform towards, but none of it is going to matter if the bot lane is nearly as much of a hindrance as it was to this team last year. Taiyun was miserable, and he simply has to be better, and Andil was somebody who came in and played a couple of games and wasn't very good for this team. They couldn't find an answer in the support position. They had June here, but June was so bad that they had to bench him. You know, shout out Fnatic. June was so bad that they had to bench him, and they brought in Moham, who was actually pretty okay for this team, but they wanted to get younger, and so they went for Andil, who was not good, and then, you know, June came back in, and it's like all this shuffling around, but, you know, maybe him coming in, maybe Andil coming in and actually getting some time to train and practice with the first team will change some things. Maybe it was just a synergy problem in the bot lane, but Taiyun and June had been playing together with DRX Challengers the year before. I can't imagine it was a synergy problem. I am just very worried about this bot lane. They both come in as the number 10 players in their position. Until proven otherwise, this is easily the worst bot lane in the LCK, and in my opinion, the worst lane in the LCK. Any lane. This is the worst one in the LCK, and it's the single thing holding them back from being a top 6 team, in my opinion, at the current moment. If they can just be average, I think you have enough talent on the top side of this map to genuinely be, like, more interesting than even, like, a top 6 team. Like, a team that you definitely don't want to run into in the first round of playoffs kind of team. But if this bot lane is as bad or even close to what they were last year, none of that is going to matter because they're just not going to be able to win a lot of games. And so I'm trying to meet in the middle with a 7th place ranking, but I really think that there is some major upside here if they can just get their weak links under control. But now we get to move on to the number 6 team in my rankings, and that means the start of my projected playoff teams here in 2024 spring. And kicking us off at number 6, again, this is not going to be a huge surprise. Top 5 is pretty locked in by most analysts. It's going to be DRX. And I don't even know if a lot of people are going to consider them, a top 6, even top 7 team moving into the split. This is very similar to, ironically, what Nongshim was last year as a team that really went for a full youth movement, or I should say a mostly youth movement. You've got 2 veterans on this team and then 3 players from the DRX Challengers team last year coming into this roster, but honestly, I feel really good about this team. I feel better about them than I do about any of the other teams that we have mentioned up until this point. I don't think they have the weak links that the other 2 teams in the B tier here have. And I should mention DRX is going to be at the top of the B tier. They are the final team that I think is in this cluster of, 3 or so teams that are competing for that final 6th playoff spot here in the LCK. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup in 2024 is looking like Rascal in the top lane, Sponge in the jungle, Satab in the mid lane, Teddy at AD carry, and Playata at support. I believe it's Satab. If it's Satab, sorry, I'm trying my best. I've been told it's Satab, so I'm going to call him Satab. But I think this roster is really interesting. Obviously, you're bringing up, a couple of young players. One of them has played, pretty extensively in the LCK before in Playata. Obviously, former Becca. He's played support for this DRX team in the past, most notably in that 2021 spring split, which was a very fun team. The team that kind of brought me onto DRX, made me a fan of this organization in the first place. But the rest of this roster also has a lot of positives. So we can go position by position, but really, at the end of the day, when you're summing up this DRX team and why they're coming in at number 6 for me in my power rankings, it's because you look at all the other teams that we've talked about, you look at Sandbox, and it's like, I'm very concerned about, the bot lane situation. I'm very concerned about Henna. I don't think Claire is a superstar. I'm not in love with Closer. I think they're fine players, but I'm not exactly sold that they're stars, even if I like some of the players. And same thing for KDF. Like, I love the top side, but the bot side is really, really concerning to me. DRX doesn't have that kind of outlier, in my opinion. Maybe they're not quite as top-heavy as either of the 2 teams that we've talked about in this tier up until this point, but I think they're probably the most complete of all of those 3 teams, which is why I'm giving them the number 6 spot right now. But let's talk about their veterans first, starting with Rascal, the only player to return here as a starter, at least in the main team from 2023. And, I got a lot of pushback last year for how negative I was on Rascal. I think a lot of people were very quick to say that Rascal was elo held on this team. I think that was a very common opinion, a very common thing to say. And, I think if you were to look at past Rascal performances, you would agree with that. He was not a player that should be on a 9th or a 6th place team, a couple, last year or even, the year before that, right? Like his KT Rolster days or even his Gen.G days. Like he was always a really solid top laner at the LCK level, but he was much more of a name than he was an asset in 2023. He really was bad a lot of 2023. I mean, you can talk about how DRX had a lot of problems. Kraka was not very good for this team. Beryl was a nightmare for this team last year, but Rascal, during some weeks, was the worst player on this team, and he was the worst player in the LCK for stretches of time. I'm not going to sit here and say that he was the only problem and that, you can't excuse some of it away by saying that there were bigger problems outside of him on this team that probably led to him playing worse. But to sit here and say that he didn't play bad last year is just not true. You would be, in my opinion, inaccurately representing what Rascal's 2023 was. It was the worst year of his career by a gigantic margin. I mean, his laning stats weren't even that good in comparison to what his averages were. It just felt like everything was kind of falling apart for him as a player. But again, the team fell apart. And so I'm willing to believe that with a better team around him, which I think you're going to have this year, he's going to get back at least closer to the form he was at. I'm going to meet somewhere in the middle and put him at number 6 in terms of my top lane rankings. Like I've talked about, top lane is a bit of a wasteland in terms of talent. There's just so many good top laners that coming in at number 6 is still really solid. That still means you're a very, very solid starting top laner in the LCK. I just need to see a bit more. I need to see the bounce back on the Rift before I call him elite again. But remember, I was the guy in 2022 that was talking about Rascal as potentially one of the best top laners in the world for KT Rolster. I'm certainly not going to be afraid to bring him back up in these rankings. I just need to see it in 2024 before I make that decision. And then the other veteran you're bringing in here is going to be Teddy in the bot lane. I'm very confused by this. I thought Paddock was actually a really interesting player for this team, and originally it was announced that he was going to be the starting AD carry for this team in 2024, and I liked that. I thought he showed a lot of growth, a lot of interesting traits over the course of last year. Pretty volatile player, certainly in the mold of a player like Elk or Jackie Love, where he's going to try and win the game on his own, and he's going to lose some games because of it, because of his aggressive positioning. But for the most part, he was mechanically talented enough to be able to back it up, and he certainly showed that he could make a team better by playing on it, but they wanted to go in a more stable direction, so they go for Teddy. Basically the opposite kind of player, right? You know, I'm lower on Teddy. I think Reddit's very high on Teddy. Twitter's very high on Teddy. I think he's a bit of a legacy player, and so some of his flaws get a little bit of a pass, but, you know, this is basically the exact opposite style of what Paddock offers as an AD carry. Paddock being probably the most aggressive ADC in the LCK last year, and Teddy being probably the most passive AD carry in the LCK last year. People were clamoring that he was elo held on Live Sandbox last year, and while I do think he wasn't the problem for a team that completely fell apart, I certainly don't think he was the solution. Teddy's not the kind of player that's going to make a bad team better. He's just never really been that. Even back in his days on Gen.G, like, he would personally perform pretty good, but the rest of the team wouldn't actually be able to win because it's just not, he's not the kind of player that is going to make a bad team better. He's not a player that you can dump a bunch of resources into and is going to single-handedly carry games. It's just not who he is. It's not the mentality that he plays the game with. But if you need a stable bot laner that is going to be fine in lane, is going to be fine out of lane, is not really going to make a ton of mistakes, isn't going to die unnecessarily, but also can just be stable and not necessarily be this big resource carry on the bot side of the map, Teddy is that guy. He's going to come in as the number 6 AD carry. I think there's potential for him to go lower in this list. I think there's potential for him to go higher in this list if this team is good. Teddy, for the most part, in his career has been an extension of the players around him. You know, outside of his days back on Gen.G, where he was, you know, a bit more of a carry. I think especially once he went over to SKT, things kind of changed. I think he became a lot more passive, and we've seen that basically at every stop since then, and so I don't really see a reason to expect that to be different. I think I would have been a little bit more excited if Paddock was here. I talked about that in my grades video, but Teddy being here, I think, adds a bit of stability that maybe you wouldn't have had in that position last year, but you're pairing him up with a player in Pliata in the support position that I love. Love Pliata. I've really been a fan of his Challengers tape. For a long time, he's been the player in the Challengers League that I've been the most excited about. People talk about Thanatos, people talk about Lucid, people talk about Call Me, you know, even players like Sponge and Satab that are on this roster that were also very good in the Challengers League last year. There were a lot of really interesting pieces in the Challengers League, but for me, Pliata was always the player that I was the most interested in watching and the most interested to see what he was going to do when he got another shot here at the LCK. I was most interested in him as an AD carry, because I do think he's actually better as an AD carry, but he's still really good as a support, and he's going to rank number 7 in terms of my support rankings, basically from moment one. I think this is going to be a very stable, very solid bot side of the map. Pliata can be a bit of a playmaker, but he is also somebody who is a little bit more on the side of, like, just carry games in the back half. Like, he's a very good team fighter. He knows exactly where he needs to be in terms of, like, the late game, and he's good at, you know, stabilizing laning phases. I don't imagine this team is going to play towards bot side a lot, is essentially what I'm saying with Teddy and Pliata down here on the bot side. I would expect this to be much more of a, you know, weak side bot lane, which can be fine, especially if you're going to, you know, put a lot more attention into Rascal or into Satab in terms of those lanes. But, you know, I think they're going to be solid. I think Pliata's a really fun player, and I think in a more aggressive lane, perhaps we could see kind of a pseudo breakout from him this split, but I think with Teddy, this is probably going to be a lot more of a stable bot lane rather than a takeover bot lane. And then you've got the mid-jungle duo both coming up again from DRX Challengers alongside Pliata, Sponge, and Satab. I like these two. I think they're going to be really fun to watch. They're both fun players. They're definitely more aggressors in terms of how they like to play the game. And I think that's going to be a positive for DRX overall. Both of them are going to come in at number 8 in terms of their positions. I do value them relatively highly. I think they're going to be better than what we saw in the bottom half of the LCK last split when we saw, like, a lot of teams start to really struggle through these positions. I think these two players should come in and be better than a lot of the players that, you know, are on Nongshim and BRION and teams like that, but they still have a lot to prove that they're going to be able to keep up with even, like, the mid-tier of teams in the LCK. I think they certainly have the talent to do so, which is why I have this team 6th. I think if I was a lot lower on these two players, I simply wouldn't have them ranked nearly as highly in this list, but I actually do have a lot of confidence that they're going to be relatively fine. Sponge in particular is a player that I really like in the jungle position. I think he's going to come in and actually be a pretty big difference maker for this team. Again, there's also been rumors and links to Tarzan that DRX has had. I don't think they would be making that change unless it was like midway through the split up until this point. I certainly think they're going to rock with these players at least at the beginning and see what they have, but if things aren't working out with a player like Sponge, you know, potentially potentially Tarzan could come in here and start for this team, but Satab is a player I'm very excited to see as well. Very mechanically talented, reminds me a lot of what we saw in Bulldog last split, but I was low on Bulldog coming up in the Challengers League for a reason because, Satab, struggles with similar things. I think he struggles with macro, not necessarily the player that is going to be shoving and roaming and playing for the team as much as you would like from that position, especially in the LCK, but if you can get him going, if you can play towards mid lane or play towards top lane, play towards top side of the map a little bit more often with this more weak side bot lane, I think that actually benefits both of these players, both Satab and Rascal, quite a bit, and Sponge as well, to be able to get more resources in that same vein. And so, I like the way they're constructed. I don't think they're a sure thing by any means. There's a real world in which this team comes out and it's just like 10th place, in the same way that Nongshim came out and was just like 10th place last year. I think that a lot of the new players could come in and struggle. Maybe I'm, a little bit lower on the veterans here. I'm not as high on Teddy. I'm not as high on Rascal as other people are. And so there are reasons to believe that maybe DRX isn't going to be a top 16, but in terms of lacking weaknesses, I think they do that a little bit better than a lot of the other teams that are kind of around them. Your FearX's and your Kwangdong Freecs. I think DRX is more of a complete team. They have more of an identity than those two teams do. But again, I could also see them finishing a lot worse than both of those teams if, Teddy continues to just be super passive and not necessarily win games. If Rascal continues to kind of show some regression signs, and if Sponge, Satab, and Pliata aren't exactly ready in the same way that we've seen, Challengers players struggle to make that transition. It's a realistic thing to expect, but I think if I had to, predict, I would expect this team to be more competitive than they are, a letdown. I think especially with how weak I consider the bottom half of the LCK, basically every team that we've talked about up until this point, I think DRX could be one of those teams that actually makes a difference, and that's why I have them here in the first playoff spot at number 6. Moving on to the top 5 now, and this is where we get to kick off our A tier. We've gone through the teams that are playoff hopefuls in the B tier that, if everything goes right, I could potentially seeing them grabbing a top 6 spot. When we get to the A tier now, these are the 5 teams, or they're not all in the A tier, but every team from here on out is basically saying we either make playoffs or we've completely busted, and honestly, all of these teams probably want to go to Worlds in 2024, and so a lot of expectations, but only a couple of spots to give. And so it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But coming in at the bottom of A tier for me and at number 5, it's not a surprise again to those who watched the grades video. It's going to be KT Rolster. And I feel really, really bad because genuinely it feels like in January of every year, KT fans get kind of shafted by me. And I get it. I get it from their perspective. It's like, why every year are you so much lower on KT than consensus? And to me, it's like, well, it's a different reason every year, right? This roster is never really the same. And, last year was the first year where I really was, proven wrong about that opinion. Last year was a genuinely great year from KT Rolster. They were the best team in the regular season in summer. And they were the 3 seed going to Worlds. They made it to the Worlds quarterfinals, only to be taken down by JD Gaming, probably the most talented roster in the world last year. And so a really, really good year in general for KT Rolster, one of the best they've ever had. Basically that in 2018. I think a lot of people would take 2018 and then 2023 as the 2 best years in KT Rolster history. And, coming off of that, they felt like they needed to make a lot of changes. So what did they do? They formed what a lot of people would consider to be, 2022 DRX 2.0. And as much as I love 2022 DRX, remember, I was the one going out on a limb during my time in 2022 talking about how much I thought that team was underrated, undervalued, and was going to surprise people at Worlds and would surprise in the LCK. And they did all that. They did everything I expected, and then even some. I didn't expect them to win Worlds, but you know what? They went and won Worlds, right? But I just don't think that the 2024 version of that is going to be nearly as successful, and I'll get into why in just a second. Their lineup in 2024 is looking like perfect in the top lane, Pioshik in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane, Deft at AD carry, and Barrel at support. Only one member returning from KT Rolster last year, or at least the main roster, that of course being BDD in the mid lane. That was a must. BDD is one of the best mid laners, one of the best players in the LCK. He comes in as my number 3 mid laner. And like I said, if you're in the top 5 of mid laners, you can basically be anywhere from I think 3 to 5 is kind of its own zone, but really even 1 to 5 are all kind of in their own little sphere. Number 3 is a very, very prestigious position. It's more valuable than any player that we've talked about in this video up until this point. BDD is the best player we've talked about in the video up until this point, and it was a big, big win to bring him back. He was really good in spring, was 3rd in my MVP voting for the entire league in spring. Didn't get as many resources in summer, but that's because I think they wanted to get a lot more comfortable playing towards bot lane, which they really didn't do in the spring split, and I think that ended up working out for them. They had a lot more opportunities to play towards bot lane at Worlds, and they ended up taking advantage of that, but BDD is just a super versatile player. He can play carries, he can play mages, he can play team fighters, he can play roamers, he can do really whatever you need him to do. He's just a very valuable and versatile mid laner that will continue to probably be one of the best players in the region. Now, it is worth noting that last year was a bounce back year for BDD, coming off of that miserable 2022 on Nongshim, but it feels like that Nongshim team was just a little bit cursed, and I would expect BDD to continue to be one of the best mid laners in the region like he was before 2022 and like he has been after 2022. But everybody else is really intriguing. We're going to go with the DRX players next. Let's start with Pioshik, and I think generally Pioshik's one of the reasons that I'm a little bit lower on this team. I don't think Pioshik is a particularly dominant player. He is a player that I feel like I've had a very good read on over the course of his career, whether that goes back to like 2020 when he, joined DRX and was given a lot of opportunity on a team that had a lot of expectation, or 2021 when he was essentially surrounded by rookies and, continued to grow as a performer. His, aggressive style was kind of, facilitated by a bunch of rookies that didn't necessarily need a ton of attention. And then, 2022, he ends up, getting benched a couple of times, but showing up when it matters the most. And, he gets on a hot run and it goes well. But even 2023, last year, people were really, really mad. I know it seems like a crazy take now, but people were pissed last year in my LCS primer video, this version of the LCS video when I put Pioshik as the number 3 jungler in the region. People were like, he just won Worlds. How is he not number 1? You're an absolute moron. And I'm like, you have to separate the player from the team that he is on. And that proved to even be basically spot on. I would say he was the 3rd best jungler by the end of the year in the LCS, but for most of the year, he wasn't even that good. So, I think coming in at number 5 here is relatively fair. I don't really see a lot of, reasons to believe that he's, guaranteed to be better than this. There are going to be some weeks where he probably looks better than this, but there are going to be some weeks where he's the worst player in the LCK. That's just who Pioshik is. He's the most volatile jungler in the entire region. I am a bit concerned because one thing that we will talk about here, I know they won Worlds together, and I get it. I get it. There's going to be people in the comment section that say, I don't know ball. I didn't watch. Did you even watch the games? Yes, I watched the games. I cover them all on the channel, but Pioshik and Beryl do not have good chemistry together. That was the biggest problem DRX had in 2022. Remember, that team went 500, and they almost didn't make Worlds. They had to climb their way through the qualifiers to get that final spot to even make Worlds. Yes, they played better at that tournament, but for most of that year, Pioshik and Beryl were the problems for that team. It was Kingen, it was Zeka, mostly, that were carrying it, and Deft was very consistent, especially in the back half of games. Pioshik and Beryl were the problems, and they're the players you're relying on the most on this KT team when you're bringing it in. So, I'm concerned about that, and, we'll talk about Beryl now. It's no secret, it's not some industry secret that I am very low on Beryl compared to Consensus. I get it. I hear you in the comment section. You say the same things every video. Beryl's a great shot caller. I get it. He is very good at leading his team, but as an individual player, he's just not that good. He's fine as a support, right? His laning is, effective. He can really support an AD carry, especially if they're not playing this super high resource style, but there are going to be genuinely like 20 or so games every split of the, however many, 30 plus games that they play in a split, where Beryl will run it down, will make one massive mistake in the middle of the game that will drastically swing the tempo and the favor in the enemy's direction. He did it on DRX when they were winning in 2022, and he was a disaster last year. I mean, he was one of the least valuable players by my metrics in 2022 when they made Worlds. They made it in spite of him. And then in 2023, he was even worse. And so I get it. He's a big name. He's won Worlds twice, but I think there is reason to be concerned. Now, he could also just be a player where you put better talent around him. He's going to be fine, but it's not like this team isn't volatile. It's not like this is the type of team that's going to be very consistent, that can make up for Beryl's sporadic mistakes. This is the type of team that is going to make a lot of sporadic mistakes, and I think Beryl is only going to propagate that even further. Perhaps I'm wrong on this. Maybe Beryl, actually locks in and actually tries, but the motivation, the focus, it's just not been there the last 2 years, and I really don't think there is a lot of signs that something like that is going to change in 2024. I hope I'm wrong, and I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt, ranking him as the number 5 support in the region. I think that certainly last year he was not number 5, and in 2022 he was not number 5. He has been worse than this the last 2 years, but it's still Beryl, and I get that there are intangibles that he has that don't necessarily get reflected in just watching the games. But when you watch the games, Beryl actively loses his team games, period. End of story, and that will have to change if KT wants to be competitive. Deft is, kind of joining here. He wanted to play with Beryl. He wanted to play with Pioshik specifically again. I get it. He has a lot of attachment towards that Worlds team. They're probably very good friends. But the last time Deft was playing with these players, he had one of his weaker splits. And I mean that in the sense of he didn't really get a lot of resources. Pioshik is very resource heavy. Beryl is very resource heavy as a support. Maybe not in terms of gold, but in terms of pressure, you have to play around him. You have to make sure that whatever play he is going for, you follow up on. Deft took a major secondary role the last time they were on DRX. His early games didn't exist. His laning stats were really bad on DRX in 2022, significantly below his career norms in comparison to the rest of the league because of the role that he was asked to play. Now, that can be fine so long as you're winning games because of it, but they were honestly a weak bot lane in terms of what they were. They weren't awful. I don't want to say that they were awful. They were just average, right? And that's not what you bring in Deft and Beryl to be. You don't bring them in to be an average middle of the pack bot lane, but that's kind of what they were in terms of, the LCK in 2022. And Deft is coming off a great year on Dplus KIA, but if he settles right back into that weak side bot laner role that has zero pressure in the early game, basically the antithesis of what he was in 2023, I think he is going to suffer because of it, and it concerns me. I think, those three coming back together, while I think on paper it looks good because they won Worlds, I think when you dig deep into, what 2022 was for DRX, I think to me, this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what made that team good, which was the ability for them to outplay and outmechanic everyone that they went up against. Pioshik, Zeka, Deft, those are some of the highest mechanical ceiling players in the world when they are playing right. And while I think that you still have that with BDD here, I think it's just a bit different, especially because you have a rookie on the top side in Perfect. As much as I like Perfect, and honestly, if you are trying to build a mechanical outplay team, Perfect might be one of the better choices to bring in. He is a phenomenal, phenomenal player. Really good at snowballing games out of control, but he's a great mid to late game team fighter. He's going to come in at number 8, but he's honestly one of the players I'm the most confident in on this team. I have more confidence in him than I do in Pioshik or Beryl, who you can basically guarantee for a couple of, weeks over the year are just going to lose you games. I don't know if Perfect's going to be that. I think he could come in and actually be a really strong top laner in the LCK from year 1, but there's also going to be a lot of expectation on his shoulders. I mean, top lane was a really high priority lane for 2022 DRX. They played towards Kingen a lot. They played towards mid lane a lot as well, but, Perfect's going to have a lot of, responsibility on his shoulders, and I don't know if he's going to be able to live up to it immediately. I actually feel he probably will be able to. Again, very good team fighter, especially if he's getting resources in the early game, but there are genuinely a lot of reasons why I am concerned that this team will not be what everybody thinks they will be. I hope I'm wrong, because I do love 2022 DRX. They really kind of exploded my channel because I was so high on them. I was one of the few analysts that was actually driving home the point that, oh no, this is a team that, is genuinely very good and everybody is underestimating them. But, in saying that, I'm now the analyst that's sitting back and saying, I don't think this is going to work as well in 2024. I think they're going to be able to beat the worst teams in the league, but I don't think the consistency is going to be there. I hope I'm wrong, but I am quite a bit lower on this team. And now moving on to number 4 in the rankings, of course. Top 4 is also pretty important here because, likely it's going to be 4 seeds for the LCK at Worlds. And so once you get to the top 4, these are the 4 teams that I would predict would be making the World Championships at the start of the year. It's a little bit more complicated than that because a lot can happen over the course of a year, and this really is a spring power rankings and not a summer power rankings, but still, these are the teams that I think have a little bit of a head start. Coming in at the bottom of that, still in the A tier here, it is going to be Dplus KIA coming in at number 4. I don't think this roster is sensational. I don't think that they are world beaters in basically any aspect, but what I do think is that they are very well-rounded. They have a very good core. They don't really have any weak links, and they do have some upside to make me believe that this could potentially be even better than what I am anticipating. This is a good team that could turn into a great team if everything were to go right. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Kingen in the top lane, Lucid in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, aiming at AD carry, and Kellen at support. Some of these rankings I know are already going to upset some people. Not that the people who were going to be upset with me haven't already left the video. I very much would be surprised if you made it an hour plus into a video where you are just so seething mad that you're angry at every opinion. But if there was a straw that was going to break the camel's back, it might be this one. It probably was KT Rolster, but it might be this one because I have some of these players rated a lot higher, I think, than other people might have them, specifically Kellen, in the support position. But of course, 2 members returning from the main roster last year in Showmaker and Kellen, and then a couple of new additions, all coming from different areas. Let's talk about it, starting with the franchise player, the massive re-signing that they were able to make in the offseason, Showmaker. Obviously, it's great that they were able to bring him back. He is Damwon, he is Dplus KIA. Him and Canyon were the core, the heart and the soul of this team and of this organization, and to be able to bring at least one of them back in the offseason is a massive win. Even if Showmaker isn't necessarily the player that he was at his peak in 2020, in 2021, when he was arguably the best player in the world, I still think he's pretty darn good, and honestly, in my opinion, he's been pretty underrated the past few years, and I don't necessarily think he's even gotten the credit that he's deserved. I've been pretty high on this Dplus KIA team, or at least I was over the course of 2023, and a lot of that was because there were moments where Showmaker looked awesome. There were stretches of 3 to 4 weeks into a split, specifically the end of spring and the beginning of summer, where I'm like, is he a top, 3 mid laner in the world? Like, is he a top 5 player in the world at the current moment? And then there would be other 3 to 4 week stretches where it's like, oh God, this guy is certainly not the Showmaker that we all grew up knowing. Like, there are good and bad moments. I think some of it is focus. Some of it is, just locking himself in mentally, because when these games did matter more, he did play a lot better. But, if you're going to get that good version of Showmaker, honestly, it's still there. I think we've seen enough flashes to say that there are the good moments from Showmaker still, and I would expect them to continue to be there this year. I like him. He comes in at number 4. Again, if you're in the top 5, you are elite. Top 3 to me is just very rich. If you wanted to put him maybe above BDD, I think that's a conversation you can have, but BDD was certainly better last year, and I would expect him to be better moving into this year as well. I think Showmaker will continue to be, at times a top 1, top 2 mid laner in the LCK, and at other times not a top 5 mid laner in the LCK. That's just kind of the way it's going to go, and I think that averages out for me at around number 4 here in my rankings for mid. And then you've got Kellen coming back here. I have defended Kellen over and over again. Man, there's a lot of hate for him on the timeline, and I just don't understand. This team was significantly worse when he left last year, when Bible came in and started in the support position. They really got bad, like, very quickly. It was very clear how much Kellen influenced a lot of their shot calling and macro decisions once he wasn't in the lineup, because their macro got so much worse. It wasn't to the effect of what Faker, was to T1, but it was kind of a similar idea of you take a player out, and clearly they were very vocal, and now the team doesn't really have a way to be able to keep that going. And then he came back in for Worlds, and they were able to he came back in for the qualifiers, and they were a lot better. They were able to make Worlds through the qualifier pretty easily, and they were decent at Worlds. Obviously, they could have been a lot better. You would have expected them to be a lot better, but I don't think it was Kellen's fault, even if he didn't necessarily play phenomenally. I have him coming in 1 spot above Beryl. That's certainly going to piss off a lot of people, because the conversation around this offseason, as I talked about in my grades video, for a lot of DK fans was, how dare we keep Kellen? Why didn't we go and get Beryl? But, to me, I have to stick to my guns, and I truly do believe that Kellen is a better player than Beryl is at the current moment. I think he certainly has been better over the past 2 years. Obviously, when you go back to Beryl's time on Damwon KIA, or Damwon in general, you can make the argument that that version of Beryl was certainly better, but I think Kellen has been underratedly very good. Whether it was with Dectum, whether it was with Deft, I think Kellen's been a very solid support. Remember, we were going into last year talking about him as a top 3 to 5 support in the world. I still think he can hit that height. I really don't think that that's out of the realm of possibility for him to hit here, and he's going to come in as the number 4 support to justify that. But 3 new additions in the other roles. We'll start with the bot lane here because, we already talked about Kellen. You're bringing Aiming in here to play AD carry. Aiming continues to kind of have a career resurgence back here in the LCK. Aiming was somebody I wrote off in 2022 as a player that just never was going to get it. He was always going to be good. He was never going to be great, or I should say in 2021, not 2022. But in 2022, he comes back to the LCK, gets a spot on KT Rolster, and actually has a complete career year. Was really good on that team, very narrowly got KT to the World Championships, but, I was very, skeptical on whether or not he was going to be able to repeat that in 2023 because he has very strong, playstyle tendencies. He's a very good late game AD carry, but he can struggle a lot in lane. Well, he actually fixed fixed a lot of the laning problems in 2023. Got to play with Lehens, who is one of the better laning supports. That is worth noting, but, you know, I was very concerned that that partnership was just not going to work out, and both of them, I think, benefited a ton from playing with each other, especially in the summer split when Aiming got a lot more resources to be able to play through. I think he's a really good player. He can play weak side, he can play strong side, very consistent towards the back half of games. If you're a more Western League of Legends fan, a player that I compare to Aiming quite a bit is Patrick on Excel or Giant X now, because I think it's very similar of like sometimes you can have those games where he's just not proactive enough in the early game to make a huge impact, but if he can get to the team fighting stage, he is just going to be better than a lot of the other players that he's playing against. Aiming does that just at a higher level of competition. So, you know, I'm happy about this bot lane. I think it's going to be very solid. You know, stylistically, I think they work together. I would expect them to be very good. Neither of them are superstars, but honestly, bot lanes aren't incredibly tough outside of the best teams in the LCK. I think they should comfortably be able to beat a lot of the mid-tier teams just with this bot lane alone. And then you're bringing in a lot of upside on the top side of this map. Kingen in the top lane, obviously one of the other players from that DRX championship team, but played for Hanwha last year, was fine, was solid, has kind of reverted back to being the Kingen that we all kind of knew, which is this weak side, fine top laner, not a superstar, but certainly somebody that you can put on a top tier team and you can win with. I don't really have a ton to say about him. I was really high on him in 2022. It felt like he was another player who had a big breakout on that DRX team in 2022, and just, you know, it was pretty predictable that he wasn't going to be able to keep that up. The talent level wasn't always there. He just had a very good role on a team that I think, you know, really needed that role. I think he might get a similar one here on DK. Kana was actually shockingly good for this team last year. If Kingen can fill a very similar role to that, I think that would be more than fine for DK. And then you're bringing up Lucid here. He is your call-up, your promotion from DK Challengers. You know, you have a lot of options there. You know, Thanatos is obviously the one that I think a lot of people wanted to point to, but in my opinion, Lucid was the better player. I think watching Challengers League tape, I went in with the expectation that Thanatos was just going to be by far the best, you know, player in the Challengers League with how people talk about him. But as I said in my grades video, I was significantly more impressed with Lucid in the jungle, who I think this team really is excited to have. I mean, if you're going to move on from Canyon, having this superstar young jungler in your system to be able to promote to replace him is a pretty good, you know, place to be. He comes in at number 7, if only because he's never played in the LCK before. But, you know, if he's even half as good as I'm predicting him to be, he will be the Rookie of the Year in the LCK. And this is going to be a really good signing, or a really good addition to this team. I like his talent a lot. He is a carry-oriented player, but he's not afraid to play more facilitators. Honestly, he does remind me a bit of like young Canyon in terms of how he plays the map, and you know, that could be huge for DK. I'm not saying he's going to be a similar player in year 1. What I'm saying is that I really like this move from an upside perspective, and honestly, he could be that in year 1. I wouldn't even be all that surprised, but he is definitely the favorite for a lot of people to win Rookie of the Year, and he's certainly going to be mine as well. But in general, when you look at this team and the construction and, you know, how they're going to perform, I really like the team that they have assembled. I think this is going to be a really cohesive, really solid unit that's going to be very difficult to deal with. Do they have the top-end talent to compete with the top 3 teams that I think are pretty locked in my opinion? Maybe not. Maybe, especially if Lucid ends up being really good and maybe Showmaker can have a bounce back here. I could see Aiming and Kellen being a really good bot lane and Kingen just being strong on the weak side. Like, there's definitely potential for this team to be really solid, but I think they're probably going to be closer to, like, a good team that just ends up being better than a lot of the middle-tier teams in the LCK that we've talked about up until this point that have some major question marks. I like DK, but they are going to be a little bit on the outside of the big dogs, at least in my projection going into 2024. And that's going to bring us to number 3 in these rankings, and this is where we really start to get to some teams that I think could potentially be world beaters. We're still in the A tier. Only the top 2 teams, in my opinion, are S tier worthy, but, you know, coming in at the top of the A tier, and pretty clearly at the top of the A tier, in my opinion, it's going to be Hanwha Life Esports. Love this team. I talked about it. I raved about it in my offseason grades video. I think they had the best offseason of any team in the LCK. I think, obviously, they got a ton better, but I think they got more better. They got more betterer than any other team in the LCK from what they were in 2023 to 2024. Their upgrades are immense, and they basically all consist of bringing in Gen.G players. Now, I do have to address it. Obviously, I'm known in my comment section as a bit of a Gen.G juicer, as a bit of a fanboy, I don't know, a biased caster. I don't really understand how I've gotten that reputation. I have consistently put Gen.G as a fine team in the world, but maybe not always one of the best in the entire world. Look at last year as a pretty good example of that in that particular instance. But basically every time that I put my money on Gen.G, they have succeeded. I put my money on them to win the summer split over T1, and they did that. I put my money on them to win the spring split, and they did that. I feel like I've actually been pretty accurate, and hopefully those players can translate over here to Hanwha life, because this is essentially a different version of the 2023 Gen.G roster, except with a couple of Hanwha life players sprinkled in there for good measure. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Doran in the top lane, Peanut in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Viper at AD carry, and Delight at support. I don't really understand why my opinions are so like roundly, I guess, hated by a lot of the community. It's very weird. I get a lot of mixed signals, I think, from a lot of, comments, and maybe you guys can help elaborate that in a constructive way, of course, down in the comments in this video, because I get called Gen.G biased, like, really, really consistently, basically all the time on this channel for just saying that they're a very good team because, spoiler alert, regular season matters a lot. If you're able to win 3 straight LCK titles, I don't really care if you win Worlds. That still makes you a very good team, like an elite level team every single year. Maybe you're not the best team in the world, but I've never claimed Gen.G is the best team in the world. They're still an elite level team and they should be treated as such, but I also get a lot of pushback on ranking individual Gen.G players too low. It's a very weird cycle that I don't really understand. I'm not really sure how I can be both. It's part of the, the fact that I just don't understand sometimes what people are complaining about with me in the comment section, but I digress. I move on to this Hanwha life explanation, and we'll get into the Gen.G players first because I've talked about them a ton, and there's a reason I'm bringing up Gen.G a lot. It's because I think this team will play like Gen.G did last year. I think they're actually going to be a very similarly constructed team, which is why I wanted to bring them up as a reference, because I think the players coming over were pretty much the tone setters, the pace setters for Gen.G last year, specifically Peanut and Delight. So let's talk about them first. We'll start with Delight because he's the player that everyone was so mad about, and they might be mad about it again in this video that I have him ranked as the 3rd best support in the LCK, but I'm sorry, I really like KIA and I really like Lehens. He was the MVP for a reason. That was a take that I did not expect to get a ton of pushback, but Delight is still a really good player who basically improved every single game over the course of last year. It is worth noting that that was the only real good year of his career in the LCK. You're going to have some, history revisionists that will tell you that he was good on Bro all along, but trust me, I covered every single one of those games on this channel. You can go back and check them out. It just wasn't the case. Maybe he had potential, but it certainly wasn't good in the LCK when he was playing with Hanwha. Once he went to Gen.G, obviously everything kind of fixed itself up, but that tends to happen with supports. It's kind of been a running trend with Gen.G going back to, basically everybody that they've had on the roster. Core JJ wasn't awful before he joined, but, basically Core JJ onwards. Core JJ, Life, Lehens, Delight. I mean, all of the major supports that they've had have gotten better because of the organization. Now, do I think Delight's going to get worse now that he's off this org? Probably not, because he's still playing with elite level talent surrounding him, and I would expect him to still be really good, but to put him in the same category as 2 players in KIA and Lehens that have been as good as Delight was last year for multiple years now, it's just not something that I'm willing to say. Delight was Gen.G's best player at Worlds, though, and so I'm happy they're bringing him in here, and he is still going to get a top 3 ranking in the support position, which is higher than what he had at any point in my rankings last year. Like I said, I felt like he got better every single game, and that culminated in a really good World Championship run from him. And then you've got the top side from Gen.G here. You've got Doran coming into the top lane. He had a career year last year in the top lane. He was a top 2 top laner in the LCK for 95% of the year. It was him and Keen as the 2 best top laners. People aren't going to like to hear that because everybody's a big Zeus fan, and I get it. He figured it out by the end of the year. Once Faker came back in the playoffs, he was phenomenal at Worlds. He was phenomenal, but Zeus was not in that conversation for a majority of 2023. You can go watch the playlist of videos that I have posted on this channel for a discussion why, and you're not going to see any pushback when I was saying that then. Doran really was that good. He was a top 2 guy in the LCK, and there's really not a lot stopping him from being that again. He was actually a lot more resource heavy than he had been in previous years, and I'm not sure that's going to continue on this team. Zeka is a very resource heavy mid laner, which we will get to, and you want to give resources to Viper. It's always kind of been better. Every team that he's played for has gotten better once they've started playing through him, and so, there's reasons to believe that potentially Doran could be a bit more of that weak side top laner that he was in 2022 again this year in 2023. 2024, but it's good to see that if he is given, resources, is given an opportunity to really just outskill his opponent and carry games in the late game, that he actually has the ability to do that at a very high level and can compete with the best top laners in the world in that structure. He's going to come in at number 3 again, just below who I consider to be the best in the world at that position. And then you've got Peanut. This is definitely going to be controversial. I have him listed as the number 1 jungler in the LCK. I don't think this should be controversial. He's been the best jungler in the LCK the last 2 years, and it's really not been all that disputable. His 2 years on Gen.G were 2 of the best jungle years we've seen from a player in the LCK in a long time. He basically took over where Canyon left off, at least in the LCK. And again, I have to stress this a lot. This is an LCK ranking. Maybe you can sit here and complain about some of the international performances, how he hasn't been better than, some of the other junglers that we're going to mention internationally, but I think international is a lot more about circumstance than it is about talent. Or at least it kind of has been over the past couple of years, and I think Peanut has proven talent-wise that he is just the most consistent jungler in the world, at least, right up there with Kanavi. I think you can make that argument between the two of them. Peanut is amazing. He's a very good player, and I think Hanwha Life being able to bring him in here is a massive coup. He has made every single mid laner that he has played with better, and you're really hoping that that can rub off onto Zeka, who is obviously looking for that real big re-breakout after 2022. I was a huge fan of his 2022. I was a big fan of Zeka before that on Billy Gaming, on a lot of the teams that he played for before that. I was a fan of Zeka's even before DRX, but once he went over to DRX, I thought he was the carry for that team for a majority of the year. Again, I have a whole playlist of videos talking about why I believe that, and while he may not have been incredibly consistent, I think he was a lot more consistent than people were giving him credit for. And honestly, he was pretty good last year as well. I think he did have his ups and downs, but the downs were significantly less than the ups. I think people just like to focus on the negatives a little bit more than the positives with some players, and Zeka definitely falls into that category, in my opinion. He still comes in as the number 5 mid laner because, again, the top 5 mid laners are all so good. He comes in right below Showmaker and BDD. That's pretty good company to be able to keep, and I think at any point in time, he could be a top 2, top 3 mid laner in the LCK. And especially if Peanut comes in and those two have very good synergy, which I think is very possible. If Zeka becomes kind of a hyper carry for this team, which I very much think could be kind of the most likely possibility, Zeka could end the year as like a top 1, top 2 mid laner in the LCK or even the world, right? If everything goes right, he has the talent to be able to do that. Mechanically speaking, he is one of the best laning mid laners in the world. And while he doesn't always transition those leads the most efficiently into the late game, he still knows how to do it at an incredibly high level. Think of the 2022 World Championships, but, a lot of people saw that as a breakout. I saw that as more of a continuation of what he had been doing up until that point. That's the kind of player I would expect him to be in 2024 if I had to project. And then you've got Viper, obviously, in the bot lane. He's going to come in as my number 1 AD carry in the LCK as well. I mean, this guy has dominated everywhere he has went, whether it was Griffin, whether it was EDG, where he won a world championship. Now here on Hanwha, everybody was talking about him being elo held for a lot of last year. I wasn't necessarily a part of that opinion nearly as much as maybe some other people were, because I do think there was talent on this team that was playing relatively fine. In fact, I think everybody with the exception of Life actually was fine on this team last year, especially once Grizzly came in and started playing in the jungle. You had Grizzly playing particularly well. You had Kingan, who was fine. Zeka, I thought, had a pretty decent year. Viper just wasn't this takeover presence that he had been on EDG, but I think he's going to be given more opportunities this year to get that back. I will say this is probably his final opportunity to be number 1. Certainly not his final opportunity to be considered elite, but there are a lot of AD carries that are knocking on the door of this number 1 spot, and I wanted to give some benefit of the doubt to Viper because there were moments and there were games last year where it absolutely was there, but I just need to see it be more consistent over the course of an entire split, of an entire year. There was a reason this team was 5th last year, even though I believe that a lot of these players were talented. It's because I don't think anybody, including Viper, ended up playing up to the expectation that we had set from them at the beginning of the year. I would expect things to go a lot better, though. Peanut just makes every team that he plays for better, whether it was Gen.G, whether it was Nongshim, whether it was LGD Gaming, even T1 back in the day, Rocks Tigers. Every single team that he has played for has gotten better because he has been on it, and there's really no reason to believe that Hanwha Life is not going to be a part of that. If Viper and Delight can continue on where Pays and Delight were last year, I think that's going to be massive. They were the best bot lane in the LCK in the regular season. If Zeka can grow again, especially if he gets more resources from the jungle position, that's massive. And Doran is an incredibly solid top laner. When I talk about there being a little bit of a difference between the top 3, I mean that. This could be potentially a world's winning team if everything goes right. That's the upside for Hanwha Life Esports. I'm not necessarily going to predict that, which is why they're still in the A tier here. Teams that really think they should be making the playoffs, but aren't, you know, favorites to win the league or anything like that, but I think it would only take a couple of weeks for me to completely change my mind and put them in that category. Out of all the teams we've talked about up until this point, this is the first one where I've really said that this could potentially be the team that defines 2024. And that's going to bring us to our top 2 teams, our final 2 teams of the video here, and the 2 teams that I have considered in the S tier. I think I hold the same opinion as most other analysts. I've seen a lot of consensus rankings, and, you know, these are the 2 teams that everybody's putting top 2, and these are the 2 clear best teams in the LCK at the current moment. 2 of the best teams in the world. S tier is, you know, the tier of teams that expect to win the LCK both times and expect to go on and win Worlds. I mean, that really is the expectation for both of the rosters that have been put together at the top of the LCK here, but one has to come in below the other, and coming in at number 2 for me, it is going to be Gen.G. I know, big shock and awe. I've got Gen.G at number 2. How could he do this? He only put him at number 3 last year, the Gen.G biased commentator. Of course, I jest. I know most of you don't necessarily look at me like that because it doesn't really make a lot of sense to look at me like that with my track record, but, you know, I have to address it because I think it's very funny. I think it's a very funny thing to talk about, but Gen.G is going to be coming in at number 2 here. This is a really, really interesting roster. I'm kind of split in between thinking that this is better and worse than their roster last year because I think on paper, talent-wise, this is an upgrade. I think basically every single position is in some way, shape, or form more interesting than it was last year, but at the same time, you know, stylistically, you have to wonder if it's maybe too many cooks in the kitchen, and that could perhaps be a problem if things don't end up meshing together in the same kind of way that they did with a really synergistic Gen.G team that played above their weight for most of last year. But, you know, let's go ahead and talk about it because I think that there's a lot of nuance to this discussion, nuance that I want to break down at least a bit in this video. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Keen in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Pays at AD carry, and Lehens at support. You've got the player who won MVP last year on this team in the summer split. You have the player who I picked to win MVP last year on this team. You have the player that I had listed as the number 1 player in the LCK going to Worlds on this team. You have the player that I think a lot of people consider to be the most dominant in terms of peak in the history of the LCK on this team. Maybe, you know, outside of like a very select few, certainly a player in that conversation. And you have arguably the best top laner of all time on this team. I mean, it's pretty freaking stacked in terms of name value and in terms of talent, but how does it stack up in terms of how I think it's going to actually play out in 2024? Well, we'll start with the players who are staying. It's going to be the 2 carry roles here. It's going to be Chovy and Pays in the mid and in the bot lane. We'll start with Chovy. He is going to come in as my number 1 mid laner. This is already going to be controversial because I love you T1 fans, but you will see anything not listed as number 1 as a negative in your department. I don't view that. Obviously, I haven't viewed that for a long time. I have these 2 with very similar grades, but Chovy is going to come in at number 1 because I think he is the most dominant player in the LCK. You can talk about whether or not his impact on the game is equal to Faker's and, you know, whether or not Faker can surpass him at times, and I would certainly have that conversation. There are going to be times where Faker is more valuable, but there are also going to be times where Chovy is just more valuable. They're different players in different ways, and I think for me, it's just hard not to rank Chovy as the number 1 mid laner in the LCK. I've been doing it for a little while now, and honestly, he has only gotten better over the past few years. He has gone from a player that, you know, at times, rightfully so, has been considered somebody who will just sit in the side lane and farm until his team loses and not really contribute, have a very low game impact, even if he is individually playing really well with a good scoreline and good CS scores, to a player that I think actively impacts the game in basically every way you can ask for from a top player all the time. Can play, you know, a supportive style for his jungle or for his bot lane, can carry from the mid lane, can shove and roam, can play this more scaling-oriented style that obviously he's more comfortable and familiar with. He can do it all now. We are at the point in 2024 where a lot of the negatives that people have talked about with Chovy have just been weeded out of his game, and that's why I'm so confident in him. 2023 was the best year of Chovy's career, and I don't even think that's really all that up for debate. Like, maybe there are years that have been more dominant in terms of individual games and performances, but over the stretch of 2023, I can't think of a more complete package from a mid laner in, you know, a long time in the LCK, maybe since Showmaker back in 2021, than what Chovy offered, you know, last year. That's what you're asking for, and really that's kind of the elite level performance that he offered. Was he always number 1? In my opinion, no. I think Faker at times was better. I think BDD at times was better, but I would rely on Chovy a bit more individually in terms of just completely taking out all other circumstances, and that's why he's going to come in at number 1. I know people are going to hate it and push back on it in the comment section. I know that, you know, people are going to say, do you even watch the games? And they're going to try and invalidate my opinion just because it doesn't agree with theirs, but I have to say it. Chovy, to me, is the most valuable player in the LCK, and I have him listed as such. And then you're also bringing back Pays in the bot lane role. He was my MVP in the summer split in 2023. I thought he was the most valuable player to his team in 2023. He was played through basically exclusively in the summer split. Like, Chovy was the supportive mid laner, Peanut was the supportive jungler, and they wanted to try to get Pays ahead to win in the mid to late game, and they were able to do that incredibly successfully. That was basically the crux of their title run, both at the end of spring and throughout all of summer when they were able to take down T1 twice in the playoffs. It was really through Pays, and, you know, I still have some doubts and some concerns because individually speaking, he hasn't necessarily shown the ability to dominate in the same way that some other AD carries have at being able to get their own leads isolated in the 2v2, but, I mean, there are very few players in the world right now that I would trust with a lead more than Pays, right? If you're able to get a lead for him with the team around him, you know, kind of playing for him, there are very few players in the world that I would feel better about doing that than Pays. And, you know, also worth noting, he's 18. He's only 18 going into his second year. It's not like, you know, the growth curve is supposed to stop after year 1. I would expect him to even be better here in year number 2, or at least that's kind of the anticipation, at least what he was in year number 1. And that, to me, at the very least, is the number 2 AD carry in the LCK. He is an incredibly dominant carry player, and he has been given a lot of resources to be able to back that up. He is a superstar, make absolutely no mistake about it. He was a top 10 player in the world, basically without any doubt last year. He could be even better going into 2024. And then you've got 3 new players surrounding them. We'll start with Lehens in the bot lane here. He was the MVP in the summer split. People tend to forget that. I know that there is this big contingent of people that are like, Delight is better than Lehens, and it's not a conversation, but first of all, not a conversation is very, I don't know, stifling towards the whole point of this video in the first place. If anything is not a conversation, then what's the whole point of even making videos, and what's the point of watching these videos if that's how you view it? But also, the dude was the best support in the LCK last year. I'm sorry, he just was, and it wasn't close. He was the only support, in my opinion, to make as big of an impact on the game as any carry role player did over the course of this year. He's still only going to come in as my number 2 support because I think projecting out into 2024, I wouldn't project him to continue to be as good as he was in 2023, but let's not pretend that that wasn't the best year of his entire career by a large margin. I know people are low on KT Rolster because they didn't end up performing in the playoffs, but that team was super good. I mean, they went 17-1 in the regular season in terms of their series scores. That doesn't happen by accident. They were the 3rd best team in the LCK. They made the quarterfinals of Worlds with the hardest schedule in the Swiss stage, and they only lost in the quarterfinals because they faced JD Gaming, arguably the most talented team in the world. That was a dominant run from KT Rolster, a really good team that I've already talked about. And Lehens, in my opinion, was the best player on that team. And, you know, I think him coming in here to Gen.G, this could potentially even be better. Now, stylistically, he is very different than Delight. Both of them are playmakers, but Lehens does it in a very different way. Lehens is a lot more aggressive and direct about how he's able to generate advantages. Delight is obviously very aggressive, and he definitely is a playmaker, but he likes to wait a bit more until the mid to the late game to be this big, you know, aggressive playmaker. Lehens will do it from minute 1 into the end of the game, right? He is just going to put his, you know, foot on the gas and really run at you as quickly as possible, and that can be good for Pays, potentially getting him leads earlier in games that he was used to, which is kind of what happened to Aiming last year when Lehens was playing with him. Or potentially we could be seeing a bit of a clash of styles because Pays is known as a bit of a slower ADC in the early game. But if they can figure things out, then I think this could be probably the best bot lane in the LCK. If everything goes right? You know, you're right up there with Hanwha and with T1 for which one you would want to pick, but they're certainly going to be in the conversation. And then you've got the top side here. The other KT player coming in is Keen in the top lane. He was the best top laner domestically in the LCK last year. I, again, don't think that's really all that up for debate. You can talk about how Zeus was the best in the playoffs, but leading up until that, like in spring and in summer in the regular season, Keen was just the best top laner domestically, and he was the other, in my opinion, big piece of why KT Rolster was so dominant. Now, there is a bit more concern considering him because he was kind of bad at Worlds, and that's certainly something I take into account, but, you know, as I say, Worlds is 1 month on one patch. You're allowed to play bad over 1 month on one patch. You know, I'm not going to define a player by that stretch of time in the same way that I wouldn't define a player by a random 4-week stretch in the middle of the season that all runs through one patch. You know, it's not an accurate way to determine whether or not a player can be good, and we know Keen can be dominant. He's arguably the best top laner in LCK history. You know, there's a lot of conversation and debate around that topic, but Keen is at least in the conversation. And coming over here to Gen.G, he's kind of a carry presence that I don't think they had last year. Doran is obviously great as a carry, and honestly was a lot better than I thought he would be, but Keen as a carry is more experienced, and he's got a wider champion pool in where he's going to be able to do that. Now, Keen is a lot more aggressive and a lot more used to resources than a player like Doran is, and so potentially that could be an issue in terms of, you know, resource management, but I still love Keen, and I still think he's going to be a really good addition. And then you're bringing in Canyon. Now, people, again, are also going to be mad that Canyon's coming in at number 3. I got a lot of comments about that in my grades video, but I'm going to say it until, you know, people's ears fall off. Regular season matters. Like, it absolutely matters, and Canyon was a big reason why DK underperformed last year. I think you could make an argument that for large portions of the year, he was the worst player on that team, and we've talked about it on this channel. I do weekly reviews for a reason. I was bringing up the negative plays that Canyon was making, and quite frankly, they didn't really get better as they got throughout, you know, this qualification process. I think some of the other players on the team just really stepped up. A player in Deft, in particular, played really well in those qualifiers, but it just was not the Canyon of old last year, and this was a similar story to what happened in 2022. Now, in 2022, he was better at Worlds. He was really good at Worlds, which just completely refreshed everybody's opinion. People forgot entirely about the bad regular season, but, you know, in the regular season, he was kind of rough in 2022, and he was kind of rough again in 2023. I still think he's an elite player. He still comes in as the number 3 jungler in the league. That's certainly not bad, but it's pretty stiff competition at the top of the standings. I mean, you really have to be like that guy to get number 1 or number 2 in the LCK, and I just need to see it again from Canyon. If, you know, after 1 or 2 weeks, he is the man again on Gen.G, if him and Chovy work really well together, if he's playing towards pace and they're getting consistent leads in the bot lane, it's immediate. Like, it's going to take basically nothing for me to be super confident that Canyon's the best jungler in the world again. I mean, really, it will take almost nothing, but I do need to see it. Like, I do need it to happen before I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that it's happening. I still believe a lot in Canyon, especially with this talent. I think it's really possible for him to just be the best jungler in the league. And truly, on paper, this is the most talented team in the LCK. I mean, certainly T1, you know, goes head-to-head with them in terms of talent, but in terms of position by position, you could make the argument that Gen.G on paper is the more mechanically talented team. I think my concern, and the reason that they are at number 2 instead of at number 1, like they were at the end of last year in the LCK, is because I'm just a little bit worried about the meshing of styles. Keen is an aggressive player who likes resources. Canyon typically is an aggressive player who likes resources. Chovy does better with resources, even though he can do a bit of both. Pays is certainly somebody who likes resources. Lahens is a very, you know, centralizing player in terms of how he plays the game. It's a lot of, you know, a lot of aggressive personalities and styles on this team, and I could see an avenue where that just goes wrong, where things do not work out, where stylistically they just don't mesh in the same way that having players like Peanut or Delight on this team did, because they weren't necessarily as polarizing and centralizing in terms of their gameplay. But if they can figure it out, that's probably the only thing stopping this team from being an absolute world beater over the course of 2024, because mechanically speaking, you know, you could put this team up against basically anybody in the world. And that's going to bring us to our number 1 team and our final team to talk about in this primer video. Those of you who have stuck around, I really do appreciate it. Really does mean a lot. We put so much effort into these videos. Obviously, making them is a lot of fun, but we got to watch a lot of these games. I don't just, you know, go off of my memory. I go and rewatch a lot of 2023 from basically every team and every new player coming into the league to make sure I'm giving you guys accurate and, you know, up-to-date analysis. And so I do hope you guys enjoyed, but you know, finishing us off, I guess I should say, with our number 1 team in this video, it is going to be T1, the top of S tier, the number 1 team in the LCK, and your reigning world champions. It just can't be anybody else at this current moment. This was the number 1 team in the world last year, at least by the end of the year. And they're back together. It's all 5 of the same members back together for a 3rd straight year with so much turnover, with so many roster changes, not just this year, but throughout the last couple of years in the LCK and the LPL and the major regions in general, for T1 to be rocking 3 years in a row with the same starting 5, some of the best players in their roles in the entire world, it's incredible. Last year at this time, we were talking about T1 as the #1 team in my power rankings in a bit of a surprising manner. People were, a bit more on the Gen.G hype train at the time, or even more so the Damwon or the Dplus KIA hype train at the time, but I stuck firm. I said T1 was the #1 team in the LCK, and alas, it kind of ended up being true. They weren't able to win any of the LCK splits, but they ended up winning the tournament that matters the most, and I do think going into 2024, they have to be considered favorites. I don't care how good Gen.G's roster looks. Until proven otherwise, I'm going to have T1, and even with the roster changes, it's not just the continuity that I think will be better for T1. I think this is a better League of Legends team on paper than Gen.G as well. So let's talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Zeus in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Keria at support. It's the same 5 all of them are world champions now, and they all deserve it. I think all of them are great in their own ways, and I get to kind of just go top to support and kind of just talk about the whole team, unlike what I've been able to do with a lot of the other teams. So let's start with Zeus in the top lane. He is going to come in as my #1 top laner. Projecting into 2024, I would expect him to be the best top laner in the LCK. I think whatever confidence barrier he had, that he clearly had, by the way, this wasn't something that was made up. There was something in him where he just lost the ability to play at a high level when he wasn't feeling himself. I think a lot of that is going to be gone now that he's won Worlds. I think there was a bit of a mental blockade that he had never gotten over the hump. He had never won the big one. But Finals MVP has been acquired. World Championship has been acquired for Zeus, and I think he's just going to have the reign of terror. I think he is a pretty nice favorite to have at the current moment to win MVP in the LCK. People were so mad in my grades video that I put him as an A- and not an A player. Well, he wasn't a top 2 top laner in the LCK last year, but do I think he's going to be this year? Yes, I absolutely do. He is my current pick to win MVP in the LCK. If I had to predict somebody, I think it's just going to be that year for him. I think we're going to be talking about this year as the year that Zeus broke out as the one getting all the resources from T1, who really just starts to dominate. I don't know why I have that feeling, but for me, it's just Zeus is going to be #1 on this list. He's going to come in above Keen, above Doran, who were better players than him for a lot of last year, but when it really mattered in the playoffs at Worlds, Zeus ended up being better than those players outside of Doran, who he never actually was able to beat. But I digress. Zeus ended up making it count when it mattered the most, and he was the best player on this team in their Worlds run. Maybe outside of Faker, but he certainly is at the very least tied, and he was a very deserving World Finals MVP. And then you've got Owner in the jungle. Probably the one player I'm a bit concerned about, and I'm being very generous here with the #2 ranking. He comes in above Canyon. I don't know if I really believe that yet. Like, Canyon probably should be at 2, and Owner probably should be at 3, but I just have a lot of faith that Owner's actually the guy, and he's going to figure it out over the course of this year. He was really awful when Faker was not playing, when he was injured. In the mid lane here, when Poby came in, Owner was like one of the worst junglers in the LCK, like full stop, not just bad for the team that he was on. He was like actively one of the most detrimental players in the LCK, but we know what Owner can do at his absolute best. Do I think he is a game-ending, world-breaking jungler? I don't think so. I don't think he is an A-level jungler. I had him at a B+ grade in my grades video. I think that that's accurate. I think that's probably closer to where he is at. He's the only player that I think is a B-graded player on this T1 team, but still, I think he's incredibly valuable. If B+ is your worst player and you've only got one of them, that's pretty damn good. It's probably the best team in the world, and that's really what T1 is looking to be. But if Owner can, even level up his game even more than what he has been in the past couple of years, which is a bit more volatile than maybe you would like on a team that is very consistent, then I think you're going to be fine. I think even for the most part, Owner is fine for this team. Like, he wins a lot of games for them as well because he is pretty volatile and they have a lot of consistency to be able to enable that. I just don't know if I would expect Owner to do as well on a different team. That's kind of the thought process, but on T1, I think he works really well for this roster. And then, of course, Faker in the mid lane. What do I have to say? For large portions of last year, he was the best mid laner in the LCK, ended up not playing the entirety of the year, was injured for pretty much the end of the summer split, and this team collapsed and crumbled without him, and that should just show you the impact that he had. He has an argument to be made that he should be the #1 mid laner, and I think that that is definitely an argument, and if you wanted to put him there, I'm not going to argue you. Like, absolutely, he's the #1 mid laner, and so is Chovy. To me, they're 1A, 1B. I don't really care which order you put them in. It's really all up to personal preference. I like Chovy's mechanical upside just a tad bit more, but, Faker is #1, right? Like, it's basically the same grade from me, and Faker is an A+. somewhere around their level player. He is that good. I am a bit concerned about the injuries. If he continues to push himself in the same way that he has for over a decade up until this point, I don't know if it's going to last nearly as long. I would honestly have signed another mid laner on this roster, not to bench Faker, but rather to be able to give him time off in the regular season if he needs it. I could see that as definitely being a possibility. This is somebody who very well might not play every single game for T1 this year, and that's fine. As long as you have the Faker that you had last year in the big moments, then I don't really care how you get there. If you need to save him a bit for the playoffs and for Worlds and for MSI, do that. If that has to be the case, then do that. But that's also going to factor into the grade of him coming in as the number 2 mid laner. But again, it's 1A, 1B more than it is 1 and 2. Then you've got Guma and KT. I feel bad for these grades because Guma is not a player who deserves to be considered the black sheep of this team. He comes in at number 3, if only because I really like Viper and Pays, and I just think ADC at the top of the LCK is the most stacked position, maybe outside of mid lane. In the LCK, and unfortunately that means Guma falls to number 3, but he is a top 5 AD carry in the world, like pretty much guaranteed. In most, years he would be a top 1, top 2 AD carry in the LCK. I just really like the 2 players that I put above him, but he's going to perform basically the same as those 2 players if he's given the same circumstance. The thing that I love about Guma Yushi is that he is very good on weak side. Like, he is probably the best weak side AD carry in the entire world. You need him to just play low resource, get to the late game, and still dominate team fights even down gold, because the other AD carry's been funneled and he has had to play from behind a bit. Like, he's still going to outperform the other AD carry. It's ridiculous, the consistency that he plays with. I'm a big fan of his, but, it's just unfortunate. He still is a really good player. Don't take 3 as any sort of disrespect. And then I have KT coming in at number 1. I'm a big KT fan. I have always been, even going back to the time before he was on T1, when he was on DRX. I've always loved KT as a player. I've always thought he was an elite level support, and while the consistency is certainly not always there, his spring was magnetic and truly one of the splits that people are going to remember because of just simply how he changed the meta with marksman support. He wasn't quite as good in summer, specifically when Faker left, but when he needed to be good at Worlds, he stepped it up and was good. I would predict that he is the best support in the LCK in 2024, even if he wasn't in 2023, domestically at least. And I think that's really the whole thing for T1, is they've had their struggles being able to actually complete things. I mean, second place in the spring split. They went 500 in the regular season without Faker in the summer split, but, they ended up making it work. They got to finals. They haven't been able to get over the hump. They haven't been able to beat Gen.G, at least domestically, obviously. They've made world finals the last 2 years. The hump doesn't exist for them, but I really do think that the next, thing on their bucket list is finally an LCK title after they haven't been able to achieve it as a unit since spring of 2022. I think they're really going to be looking for that in spring of 2024, and at least at the current moment, for me, they are absolutely the favorites to win that. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK 2024 Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. Again, I really do hope you guys enjoyed. We put so much time and effort into these videos, watching tape on every single one of these players, watching tape on all of these teams in order to get an accurate opinion, and then, really diving in and making a lot of this happen. If you did enjoy it, would really mean a lot to me if you hit that like button. There's going to be some dislikes on this video, as there is on basically all of my opinion videos, but specifically with the LCK, where I think, especially recently, a lot of fans have become very vocal, and, it's kind of just the case for League of Legends, but, there's going to be some hate towards this, and so if you did find yourself enjoying it, even if you don't necessarily agree with all the opinions, if you enjoyed the video, how it was presented, perhaps, just the effort that goes into it, it would really mean a lot to me if you left a like on it. It really does mean a lot more than you guys know. It really does, really does mean a lot, and so I really do appreciate it. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be posting about the LCK all year long, every single week, as we do every year on this channel. We'll be doing weekly reviews, starting, of course, with the games that are kicking off as this video is going out. I'm very, very excited for those, but it's not just that. We cover all 4 of the major regions on this channel. The LEC primer is already up. The LEC Week 1 review is going to be coming out tomorrow, and then the LCS, the LPL, the NACL, they're all going to be following in the upcoming weeks, and I can't be more excited. So hit that subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all